Speaker, at the annual assembly of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly in 2019, there was a report published about the growing maritime threat from Russia. Could I ask my honourable friend whether you meet with me and other members of the Assembly so we may feed into the review about the forward ongoing naval demands for the foreseeable future?
Mr Speaker, can I congratulate my honourable friend for his work he's doing in leading the UK delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. The UK, along with NATO allies, takes the maritime threat from Russia very seriously. This tempo and assertiveness of our operational output will continue for as long as Russia continues to pose a threat and challenge to freedom of navigation. My honourable friend, the Minister for the Armed Forces, would be delighted to meet with you and your colleagues to discuss it further.
We now come to Shadow Secretary of State John Healer with the first of two.
Mr Speaker, as we belatedly go into this second national lockdown, can we as a House pay tribute to the role of the armed forces? And can I say to the Defence Secretary, his commitment to regularly update the House on the use of the armed forces in this second lockdown is very welcome. And if he is willing to make further use of the forces this time, then this House and the public will back him. Can I also pay tribute, Mr Speaker, to the professionalism of the Special Forces, who took back control of the nave Andromeda last week. With the integrated review in mind, this is a timely reminder that while high-tech weapons are essential, our highly trained British troops are indispensable. Now, the Secretary of State last month at the dispatch box said and promised, I quote, a multi-year integrated review with a 4-year spending settlement for capital and a 3-year settlement for revenue. When will it be published?
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for paying tribute to the armed forces. He is of course right that the armed forces has gone above and beyond in making sure that we get through this COVID process. That is because of their training and the skills that they possess, and the fact that we can answer the call to help with resilience throughout the country. We won't hesitate to take advantage of all their skills. The demand must of course come from the ground up, from local authorities up, or indeed from the rest of government. We stand by with our offers to any part of government and devolved governments as well to help them in that struggle. On the subject of the integrated review, as I said to my honourable friend earlier, the integrated review will be resolved where we're going to go with it. We are thinking through those issues of the impact from the Treasury's announcement that there will be a 1-year spending settlement. Once we have thought through those consequences and indeed worked through the implications, as I said, I will report straight to the House with what that means.
John Healy.
Isn't the regrettable truth, Mr Speaker, that the Chancellor has cut the ground from under the Defence Secretary and our British forces? He's rightly said that previous Tory defence reviews have, I quote, failed because they were never in step with spending plans. They were a cover for cuts, which is why our armed forces are nearly 12,000 short of the strength promised in the 2015 review. Essential equipment from new tanks to the new radar system protecting our aircraft carrier is long overdue, and the defence budget has a £13 billion black hole. At this time, when a fully fledged, fully funded strategic defence and security review is needed now more than ever, what does the Secretary of State say about any failure to deliver on this?
Mr Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman has delivered the speech for potentially a statement in the future. And no one has said yet that the integrated review will be delayed or curtailed. What we are saying is at the moment we are studying the implications of the 1-year spending review on that. Once we've worked through what those implications, then of course he is welcome to make his point across the dispatch box. And I know he's keen to make those points, but I would respectfully suggest that he waits until we have thought through those implications, and then of course we can have that discussion in Parliament.
Assembly spokesperson Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Mr Speaker, ahead of Remembrance Sunday at the end of this week, Mr Speaker, can we wish well all of those organising events in a very different fashion, but the day, of course, doesn't lose its meaning at all. On this issue of the integrated review, Mr Speaker, I'm sure the Secretary is more frustrated than most. As an avid reader of the NEO reports, he will know that pushing spending to the right ultimately will leave him with less money to spend. So a multi-year settlement, long advocated by these benches, would allow for future-proof planning. So, can the Secretary tell us what the consequences for the postponement are for the future nuclear warhead system, and in particular the W93?
I think, like the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite, I think the first thing is to wait until we have worked through the consequences of the one-year spending announcement by the Treasury. Then I'm happy to come and update the House, or indeed the Prime Minister, about what that means for the integrated review and all the consequences that follow from it.
Sir Malcolm Macdonald.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately for the Secretary, we can all see where this is going, and he knows that as well as we do. Now, back in April of this year, the Secretary wrote to members of Congress stating that, and I quote from his letter, support to the W93 warhead programme in this budget cycle is critical to the success of a replacement warhead programme and to the long-term viability of the UK's nuclear deterrent. Now, we read in the press about his department's alarm that a victory for the Democratic nominee in tomorrow's election could stymie congressional and US support for that programme. So, as his own Treasury and UK alliances let him down, does the Secretary of State agree with the assessment made by Tom McTague in today's Atlantic that if the election of one presidential candidate over another is an existential challenge, then perhaps the issue is Britain's strategy itself?
No, well, Mr. Speaker, I don't agree at all. And I think he is maybe slightly confused that, of course, 1 year or multi-year, it doesn't mean to say that the defence budget goes to zero. We will still have a £41 billion budget, one of the biggest budgets in Europe, which will allow us to continue with not only running the armed forces but investing in them. What we, of course, the challenge, which we have always been open about, is the black hole in the overall finances, which we will have to take steps to meet. But that doesn't mean to say, and I'm sorry to disappoint some of his anti-nuclear colleagues, that that means the end of the nuclear deterrent or the submarines. The budget will not resort to zero after the 1 year. So I think we should, first of all, work through what 1 year means versus multi-year. It's not the first 1 year, and it's not the first defence review that in the past is trying to fix the underfunding and over-ambition. I distinctly remember serving in the armed forces when Labour's ones did exactly the same.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Elwood.
Speaker, I can tell the Secretary of State what a one-year funding settlement will be. It will make the integrated review next to meaningless. The Prime Minister gave me a direct assurance that the integrated review would not be delayed. And if Global Britain is an instruction and not a strapline, then this review is the roadmap as to how we advance our defence posture to support our foreign policy ambitions. Any delay to its publication with its full spending commitments will send a poor signal to the world that we are absolutely serious about re-establishing our global credentials, and could actually prompt questions about our justification to retain a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Could I urge the Defence Secretary to complete this review as promised, with a multi-year funding settlement, taken in isolation if necessary, if this spending review is to be delayed?
My right honourable friend raises some interesting observations, and first of all, can I just ask him, like I've asked others in the chamber, just to wait until we see what the implications are of the Treasury's announcement of the 1 year review. Until that time, I think speculation is what it is. It's just speculation. But of course, he may like to take his message to the next Treasury questions, where they too can hear what his views are of the impact.
In withdrawal, let's go to Nick Fletcher.
15, Mr. Speaker.
Defence continues to play a vital role in the response to the COVID-19 outbreaks. Defence is currently supporting 34 MACA tasks, including environmental health technicians to support Liverpool City Region and planning teams supporting Nottingham City Council and Lancashire Local Resilience Forum.
What role does my right honourable friend see the armed forces playing in the event that a vaccine is to be rolled out?
Mr. Speaker, Defence has deployed already military personnel to the vaccine task force. Personnel supporting central organisation within the task and exploring how Defence could bring logistics support to the national rollout of a future vaccine.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MOD leads on strategic export campaigns to our NATO partners, and from my personal contacts, including recent trips to Estonia and Poland, I know how respected UK military kit and innovation is. We work closely across government to support British exports and Western security.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently had the pleasure of meeting the Chief Executive of Mees and Westleys in their site in Newcastle-under-Lyme. where they manufacture in North Staffordshire key naval castings, high-integrity castings for the UK naval supply chain. They're already exporting 5% directly to the States, another 5% through intermediaries. Will he praise them for their export success so far, and will he work with the Secretary of State for International Trade to encourage further export success in the future?
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely congratulate the company on their successes both at home and overseas. I work closely with colleagues in DIT, particularly in the Defence and Security exports team, and I will happily, via my honourable friend, introduce them to that team and see what they can do to assist them.
Peter Gibson.
17, please, Mr. Speaker.
As shipbuilding czar, I'm working with Cabinet colleagues to supercharge the British shipbuilding industry. Driven by the Ministerial Shipbuilding Working Group, in the past 12 months, this government has signed the contract for 5 Type 31 vessels to be built in Rosyth, developed a maritime enterprise export plan to pursue export opportunities, which will deliver, hopefully, state-of-the-art British ships to our global allies, and launched a major analysis of the skills required in the broader maritime sector through the Maritime Skills Commission.
Speaker, my father worked as a shipwright at Smith's Dock on Teesside, and I know the UK has a proud history as one of the greatest shipbuilding nations in the world. As we leave the EU, can I ask my right honourable friend what steps he is taking to ensure that all parts of the UK benefit from shipbuilding opportunities supporting the military?
Mr. Speaker, this government's ambitious shipbuilding agenda is reinvigorating this industry, including where his father works. We are working to review old yards, diversify the industry's portfolio to promote smaller, innovative vessels and strengthen the national supply chain which underpins this. We will support tens of thousands of jobs across the UK, securing benefits for every corner of the Union and bringing shipbuilding back home to the United Kingdom. We are intending to use as many of our defence contracts in order to incentivise investment by owners of yards and indeed to invest in the workforces.
18 withdrawn, so we're going to Shadow Minister Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State heed the pleas of his backbenchers, listen to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State's recent strategy of Built in Britain for the defence industry? I reiterate, follow the strategy of the Shadow Secretary of State to ensure the UK engineering and manufacturing industry endures the COVID recession. Invest in British engineering and manufacturing, invest in British people, invest in the British economy.
Grateful to the honourable gentleman because I agree with everything he said. That is what we've been doing. We will invest where we can in UK equipment. We also have to sometimes balance either the urgent operational need of our service personnel, if there is something that they need now or in very short term, and we don't simply have that capability to deliver, we will obviously sometimes have to look to where we can to get them the best equipment. It is always a fine balance about making sure our forces have the very best at the very moment with long-term investment. I'm determined that we invest both in the people who use our equipment in the MOD, but also we invest in our industry as far as possible across the board.
Smith.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister Matt.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll take questions 20 through to 24 together. The government has been proactive in providing support to the charity sector in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The MOD and the Office of Veterans Affairs have played a leading role in this effort by providing £6 million in funding for the armed forces community through the COVID Impact Fund.
Cat Smith.
Mr. Speaker. In June, the ONS reported that almost 1 in 5 adults were likely to experience some form of depression during the COVID-19 pandemic. And given that service and veterans charities have seen a spike in demand for their services, can I ask what steps the department is taking to support veterans, serving personnel and service family members during this very difficult time?
It's completely accepted that this period of lockdown and the lockdown that's coming presents very particular challenges for a veteran community that in some small parts may be struggling with the situation. We've worked hard to go down that pathway of blending both the statutory and the state provision, working with our third sector to make sure that people are being looked after on time in suitable care pathways. We have more to do, but we're a lot better than we used to do, and I'm confident that we will be the best country in the world to be an armed forces veteran in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the North East, we send proportionately more people into the armed forces than any other region, and we are proud of our veterans. Forward Assist helps them transition into civilian life. And when they moved online, they found that referrals quadrupled from a far field as Germany, and the overwhelming demand for mental health support. They need funding to improve their digital infrastructure and find mental health professionals to provide the support, which will go up again with the second lockdown. Will he provide it?
I pay tribute to Tony and all of the team at Forward Assist. They do an incredible job in the North East, and indeed are a good template for others to follow across the country. More money is going to veterans' mental health than ever has been before, in terms of the transition liaison service, the complex treatment service, and the high intensity service we're bringing on board later this year. We're always happy to look at doing more, but I'm confident it is a need that is expanding, and we are meeting a great deal of that need at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liverpool Veterans Headquarters has seen a significant increase in demand for its services throughout this pandemic, especially around mental health support. This situation is likely to worsen in the coming months, and the support this local charity offers will be in greater demand. The resources that they have is stretched beyond capacity. The 6 million just alluded to is not enough. Can the Minister explain how we will redress this shortfall?
Minister. So using the transition liaison service, the complex treatment service, the high intensity service, those are the three frameworks where care pathways, all mental health care pathways will go through for veterans in this country. And there's an opportunity there for third sector companies like Forward Assist and others that have been mentioned to bid into those programs. Indeed, they are already running some of those programs in the Northwest and the Northeast. That is the future, a blending of third sector and statutory provision. There is resource in this sector. We need to do more to make it easier for people to understand, but I'm confident of the way ahead.
It's Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Each death by suicide is a tragedy, and it is a great concern to the military and veteran community in my constituency of Jarrow and across the country. Can the Minister outline the scope of the Department's study into the cause of death of military personnel who were deployed on combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and when will the study be published?
So we've got a number of studies going on now. This country's traditionally been a poor collector of data when it comes to veterans affairs. We're looking at, for example, a cohort study looking at 20,000 people who went through Iraq and Afghanistan and what happened in their lives. We're also looking into each individual who takes their own life and doing a study into the 12 months prior to that incident to work out if there is anything that any government or third sector provision could have done to intervene. I accept that we come from a low base when it comes to data. That is now changing, and I hope that we will be able to do as best a job as we can in fighting veteran suicide.
Let's head to South Wales with Gerald Jones. Gerald Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that there were recent announcements of job losses at Help for Heroes, in addition to the closure of all but one of their recovery centres due to a reduction in funding as a result of COVID-19. If that's the case in one of the UK's biggest household names, which is under huge financial pressure and having to make such difficult decisions, what further support will the government give to service and welfare charities to fill the gaps in the coming months, because we know that the demand...
Yes, I mean, my honourable friend's right to raise it. I spend every day fighting for more money to get into this sector. What I would say is that the veterans care sector is changing, and in aspects it needed to change, where we've seen a decrease in giving as the overt nature of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan has faded, and yet the demand continues to go up. That delta is being met through these new programmes that I've outlined. There is always more to do, and I'm happy to speak to my honourable friend outside of the chamber to hear his particular concerns.
Let's head up to Washington with Sharon Hodgson, the Shadow Minister. Shadow Minister Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the last defence questions, the Minister said that for too long we have over-relied on the third sector when it comes to veterans' care, and I totally agree. COBSIO reported as far back as June that 1 in 10 armed forces charities will have to close in the next 12 months as a result of coronavirus. These pressures will only intensify with the second lockdown imminent. So what urgent action will the Minister take to ensure that no gaps in charity provision and vital support arise over the next 4 weeks?
Yeah, I want to be clear with my honourable friend. There is definitely a rationalisation and a professionalism going on in the veterans care charity sector at the moment, and in many, many aspects that needed to happen. My concern is veterans and their provision and what it looks like to the veteran, and we're working hard to seamlessly bring together that panoply of care, whether it's in the third sector or statutory provision. We will get there. There are financial challenges, but I'm confident we can meet them, and this country will be the best place in the world to be an armed forces veteran.
Substantive question to Minister Mercer from Stephen Metcalfe.
We are unstinting in our admiration and gratitude for our armed forces who perform exceptional feats in incredibly difficult circumstances to protect this country. We rightly expect the highest standards of our service personnel. We also owe them justice and fairness. We have introduced the Overseas Operations Service Personnel and Veterans Bill to help tackle vexatious claims and end the cycle of reinvestigations against our armed forces personnel and veterans. And this bill will have its report stage and third reading tomorrow.
Heading to Stephen Metcalfe in Essex. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for his response? And can he give me assurances, and the whole House assurances, that veterans' rights to claim against the MOD will in turn also remain protected?
Yes, the majority of personal injury and clinical negligence claims by service personnel and veterans against the MOD do not directly relate to overseas operations and so will be unaffected by the Overseas Operations Bill. Veterans will still be able to bring claims relating to overseas operations against the MOD within a reasonable time frame. For example, in the event of a late diagnosis, service personnel and veterans will be able to bring personal injury claims against the MOD for up to 6 years from their date of knowledge.
Mark Jenkins.
Question 27, Mr. Speaker.
The Overseas Operations Bill will not prevent service personnel and veterans from bringing personal injury claims against the MOD in relation to overseas operations within 6 years. Historically, we assess that the vast majority, around 94%, have done so already for claims relating to overseas operations. We will, of course, aim to ensure that everybody in the armed forces community is made aware of their right to bring claims and changes to the relevant time limits for doing so in relation to overseas operations.
Jenkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his answer. Does my honourable friend agree with me that the rhetoric around exemptions from torture mislead colleagues and the public and only serve to misrepresent the purposes of this long overdue bill?
No. But look, let me be really clear on these issues around torture. Nobody on this side of the House, nobody in this House on whatever side would want to reduce our safeguards against torture. We have to be realistic against what this country has put its servicemen and women through in terms of historic allegations. Credible allegations will always be investigated. It is not right to say it's almost impossible to prosecute, and I think people peddling that know it to be untrue. I'm happy to work with anyone to improve this bill, but we have to operate in the real world.
Stuart Anderson.
Question 29, Mr. Speaker.
The MOD's Veteran Welfare Service provides advice and information on areas such as health, statutory benefits and pensions to all ex-service personnel and their families. Other areas of veterans' welfare, such as health and benefits, are the responsibility of their respective departments, and my officials work closely with theirs to ensure a joined-up approach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is the Minister taking to remove negative stigma around mental health issues for veterans?
I pay tribute to my honourable friend and to his tireless campaigning on these issues. It is true to say that we are light years away from where we were, but there is still more work to do. The vast majority of people who and families I deal with, of people who have taken their own lives, have not spoken out and have not reached out for help, and that still remains the biggest challenge in fighting the challenge of veterans' suicide. We've made great progress. I pay tribute to all of those who've come with us on that journey, but it's clear we have more to do, and I'm determined to lead that fight.
Bel Ribeiro Abbey.
Question 30, Mr. Speaker.
30? 30? Yeah. As I said in response to the question from my honourable friend, the member for Workington, the Overseas Operations Bill will not prevent service personnel and veterans from bringing personal injury claims against the MOD in relation to overseas operations within 6 years from either the date of incident or the date of knowledge. Claims by service personnel and veterans that are not related to overseas operations are unaffected by this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members begin to wear their poppies across this House, I wanted to remind the Minister of comments from Charles Byrne, the director of the Poppy Appeal campaign. He said the 6-year-long stop could be a breach of the Armed Forces Covenant and that the 6-year limit is protecting the MOD rather than service personnel. The government says this bill is about protecting veterans. So given this is what many veterans organisations are saying, will the government think again about the 6-year limit? And will the government also commit to promoting awareness of how to bring forward civil claims against the MOD to ensure that no veteran is unable to make a civil claim in the future?
So it's not true to say that many veterans organisations take the same view as the Legion on this case. No one, the Legion, the government is not the guarantor of the Armed Forces Covenant. I'm absolutely 100% sure that this does not breach the Armed Forces Covenant. If you were to translate it, if you were to willfully translate it in a way in which it was never intended, then I accept that. But that is not what the Armed Forces Covenant is there to do. It is to ensure no disadvantage for those who serve. And this government is the first one to actually legislate, bringing forward in the Armed Forces Bill next year, to make it illegal to discriminate against servicemen and women and veterans for their service. So I'm afraid I disagree on that point. It's a good bill, it's fair, proportionate, and people should support it tomorrow.
Substantive question to Secretary of State Wallace from Alan Dorrans.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to answer questions 31 and 32 together. The protection of UK territorial waters is a cross-government responsibility. The Ministry of Defence contributes to this by providing a multi-layered capability to deter incursions into territorial waters. This includes a range of assets based in Scotland, from surface ships and submarines based on the Clyde to the new Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft based at RAF Lossiemouth. This is a good example of how United Kingdom Defence contributes to the security of all these islands.
Going up to Scotland with Alan Dorrans. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell us how his plans will ensure our armed forces can cope with the multiple tasks, including combating people and drug trafficking and foreign incursion into our territorial waters and airspace, as seen recently? And will this specifically include living up to the government promise to establish a frigate factory on the Clyde?
Well, first of all, the honourable gentleman will know that one of the ways we cope with securing our borders, both inside and further afield internationally, is by burden sharing and working across a range of agencies, including with the Scottish Government, who obviously have control of fisheries protection. On the issue of a frigate factory, first and foremost, the last two major shipbuilding contracts for defence have been placed both in Scotland, the Type 26 on the Clyde, and indeed the Type 31 at Rosyth. Good United Kingdom shipbuilding will, of course, always involve Scotland, as long as Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom.
Let's head up to Alan Brown in Scotland. Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scottish waters comprise over 60% of the UK's waters, yet we've got no surface warships. In fact, the most northerly surface warship base is located in the south coast of England, and this means that scrambling the fleet-ready escort takes over 24 hours to reach Scottish waters. Now, given there's almost monthly transgressions into Scottish waters and we need regular patrols, why is the Rosyth base being scrapped?
The honourable gentleman's claims would have some credibility if his party wasn't busy trying to scrap the HM submarine base on the Clyde and push them out of Scotland.
Right, let us go to Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministry of Defence only uses non-disclosure agreements in its commercial arrangements by exception when there's a specific need. Whilst no trend analysis has been undertaken, it remains the case that NDAs are only used where absolutely necessary.
Kevin Jones.
Except NDAs are important in terms of financial contractual obligations. But is he aware that his department are asking industry at pre-bid stage to sign NDAs which actually exclude those companies being able to speak to MPs or ministers? Now, I understand some US primes like Boeing and Lockheed Martin are refusing to sign them, quite rightly. So can I ask him why his department are now getting companies to sign these NDAs for contracts such as Skynet, for example?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of any company complaining about NDAs, and if the Honourable Gentleman is aware of some, I would really encourage them to get in contact with me direct, and I would take that up. I will take it up. There are many means, Mr. Speaker, including trade associations and other means whereby they can put the word to ministers if they are concerned. NDAs do have a valuable role, including protecting the interests of the commercial entities themselves. They normally work both ways, and many companies are reluctant to share intellectual property and research and development with another entity without having their own positions protected. So NDAs do actually have a benefit for companies as well.
We have a substantive question to Minister Quinn from Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Speaker. Indeed. We have maintained a close and ongoing dialogue with defence manufacturers throughout the pandemic to ensure that companies are effectively supported. I am pleased to confirm that orders have continued to be placed throughout the crisis.
Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Airbus and Steel and Neath Talbot are essentially strategically important to the Welsh economy. And I want to ask the Minister whether he is ensuring that procurement is brought forward in terms of buying aircraft and building ships that helps British Steel and helps Airbus, given that Boeing, for example, are having a lot of orders in America that's supporting them as a primary competitor, and we see such support in Europe as well. So what's he doing for Airbus and for Tata Steel?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are elements of programmes that are being brought forward. The prime focus, however, is supporting cash flow of the companies now, and the companies and our suppliers. We have the means of doing so. We have been doing so. And we've also been encouraging primes to support their own supply chains. And from what I hear from trade bodies, that has been happening. And I'm pleased at the way the whole of industry has lent in during this ongoing pandemic and the support they've been given right the way across.
Thank you. Owen Thompson in Scotland. It's actually substantial to Minister Secretary Wallace.
The Ministry of Defence takes the threat posed by malicious disinformation campaigning by state and non-state actors very seriously. Working with allies and partners across government, collectively, we monitor such activity closely, assess the risk and take action to counter them if appropriate.
Going up to Scotland with Owen Thompson. Owen Thompson. That solves that problem. We'll then go straight to top bittles. And the top bittle question is to Secretary Wallace from Peterborough. Secretary Wallace.
Number one. Oh, sorry.
One.
Mr. Secretary, the Government is committed to ensuring that we have the best possible process for timely and effective investigations into serious allegations arising from future military operationals overseas. That is why, building on the review of the service justice system done by His Honour Sean Lyons and former Chief Constable Sir Joan Murphy, I announced on the 13th of October that I have commissioned a review to be led by Sir Richard Henriques. Sir Richard Henriques was appointed to the High Court bench in 2000, tried several high-profile terrorist cases and has conducted several reviews for the Crown Prosecution Service and Metropolitan Police. His review will consider options for strengthening internal investigation processes and skills, thus helping to ensure that our future complex and demanding operations around the world, our armed forces are continuing to uphold the highest standards of conduct. This will not revisit past investigations or prosecutorial decisions.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Secretary of State for Defence whether he believes that not having a multi-year defence settlement would be catastrophic?
My honourable friend will know that last year we didn't have one either, but we got a generous settlement for the Treasury for that 1 year. It is of course the case that any department that is has a heavy reliance on capital spending, prefers long-term spending commitments from a treasury. That was true a decade ago, and it is true today. That is our preference. However, we also are living at a time of COVID-19, more than a once-in-a-generational challenge to both the coffers of this country and indeed the conduct of this country. And therefore, as a result, we will have to review each issue as it comes. As I said, we're in the middle of a form of negotiation, trying to see what the impacts will be of the announcement.
Just say, topicals are meant to be short and punchy. We've got to get into the habit. Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State, John Hay.
Mr. Speaker, as we've seen this afternoon, there is growing cross-party concern over the Secretary of State's Overseas Operations Bill. Will he now accept, after 10 committee sessions, it is clear that this is a bill that simply does not do what it says on the tin to protect British troops overseas from vexatious litigation and repeat investigations? Will he also accept, as we've seen this afternoon, that the Minister in charge is in denial about the bill's flaws and its dangers? So will the Secretary of State himself join me tomorrow for the report stage so that we can work together on the changes needed to make this legislation fit for purpose?
Front benches, once again, if you're going to ask questions in topicals, they've got to be short and punchy. That's the idea of topicals. Secretary of State.
No.
There we are, that's an easy way of doing it. Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, now that we've left the EU, what assessment and representations is my right honourable friend making about interoperability between procurement done by EU members through PESCO?
As NATO's leading European ally, we work closely with allied nations and do not need formal EU programmes to do so. However, I understand the EU is in the final stages of agreeing third country participation rules for PESCO, and we of course look forward to seeing them in due course.
Going to John McNally up in Scotland. John McNally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the death of Captain Dean Sprouting by American soldiers on the 31st of January 2018 whilst on deployment in Iraq, his widow Linda and two sons Oliver and Harry have been seeking justice on behalf of Dean. How can it be right for the British government to allow those who killed Dean to investigate themselves by themselves, for themselves, and decide for themselves only to then defend themselves? And particularly at this time of year, we're reminded and are mindful of Dean's futile loss of life. Is the Secretary of State willing to challenge the US over this concealment of injustice?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've met the widow of Dean Sprouting on a couple of occasions now. I'm more than happy to do so again. This incident has been investigated as a tragic incident. I'm happy to speak with her again, but I'm not sure there's too much more we can do.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Royal British Legion branches across the country are getting ready for Remembrance Sunday, and I pay tribute to them, including my home branch of Clanvacarinian, who have filled the village with poppies. Can I ask the Secretary of State what guidance he's given to the devolved Assembly's local authorities to encourage them to hold remembrance services this Sunday?
So this is a very important time of year for the country. We encourage people to remember in their own way. There will be guidance given out by local authorities, but remembrance events will be able to go ahead. There will be a small national ceremony at the Cenotaph that we encourage people to watch on television.
Chris Elmore.
Mr. Speaker, could the Minister provide an update on the voter ID card rollout? I know there was a statement in April, but my constituents, former veterans, are asking when this will be implemented. It's of huge concern to constituents who rightly deserve the ID card.
So Veterans ID, not voter ID. So Veterans ID card, yes, it should have come out at the end of last year. It's been delayed. Everybody who leaves the military now gets a Veterans ID card, but there are challenges in backdating it and dealing with things like fraud that we accept, that we're working through at the moment. I'll have an update in due course.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister to update the House on the activities and investment that the Ministry of Defence plans for Scotland in months ahead?
Secretary of State.
Defence continues to invest in Scotland and the critical capabilities based there. Both RAF Lossiemouth and Her Majesty's Naval Base Clyde are expanding and will be home to the new maritime patrol aircraft and all Royal Navy submarines. MOD expenditure with industry in Scotland has increased for the 5th consecutive year, supporting 10,200 jobs, equivalent of £320 per person in Scotland. Approximately 10,000 regular armed forces personnel, 5,000 reservists and 4,000 civilians are based in Scotland.
Let's head up to Liverpool with Bill Esterson. Bill Esterson.
Why does the Defence Secretary think the Royal British Legion are so adamant that the Overseas Operations Bill breaches the Armed Forces Covenant and fails to protect veterans?
So again, that's completely incorrect. They don't think that. They think there is a risk. They have outlined that risk. We've taken that risk into consideration. It does not breach the Armed Forces Covenant. It's a good piece of legislation. The House should support it tomorrow.
Pauline Latham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps has he taken to ensure that the UK Armed Forces will not be complicit in sexual exploitation and abuse by international peacekeepers in Mali?
Minister, I think, or Secretary of State.
So this country has a very long-standing system of safeguards to make sure that we have strong safeguards against that sort of behaviour. Everyone deploying to Mali will be equipped with the mission-specific training that we've done on operations over many years now. We have some of the highest and most rigorous standards in the world, and these will be continued in operations in Mali.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the vital Crow's Nest project for the carriers has faced severe delays. Delivery is now promised for September 2021, 18 months late. So can the Minister confirm it'll definitely be ready next year?
I confirm that a baseline capability will be sailing with the carrier strike group next year.
Let's head up to Rutland with Alicia Kearns. Alicia Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has the Secretary of State made regarding recent revelations by Bellingcat that Russia continues to develop covert chemical weapons and targeted and more advanced delivery mechanisms in an enormous violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention? And what does that tell us about the threat we face, and what is he doing to keep us safe?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend, the member for Maidenhead, confirmed that the Salisbury Novichok attack in 2018 was carried out by the Russians and that it had an undeclared chemical weapons programme. We've repeatedly called on Russia to declare Novichok programme and uphold its international obligations under the Chemicals Weapons Convention. We have brought in sanctions against those responsible for Navalny poisonings, and we'll keep every measure under review.
Very McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With almost 400,000 acres in England, the Ministry of Defence is one of the biggest landowners in this country. What is it doing to ensure that it is environmentally sustainable and also helping the government meet its target to plant many more trees?
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm speaking to my colleagues across government as to how we can help the programme of having more trees in the environment. There is a large programme already ongoing in the estate. I can assure her we're very proud of the SSIs under our control and what we're doing for the natural environment.
Sarah Brittley.
Hamburton Hassenden is famous for the Accrington Pals and has a proud record when it comes to representing this country. And I also have great people such as a team of veterans in communities who I recently had the pleasure of meeting in Haslingden. Would my right honourable friend agree to look at whether a recruitment office can be opened in my constituency so that our armed forces can attract more of Lancashire's finest?
Minister.
My right honourable friend is a strong advocate, and Accrington has a long and proud history of providing people for the armed forces. My right honourable friend, the Minister for the Armed Forces, would be delighted to meet up with my honourable friend to do a visit, look at all the recruitment offices and see if there's a space that we need to be filled up in Accrington.
Nothing prouder than the Accrington and Chorley Pals. Yeah. We're now going up to Manchester Central with Lucy Powell. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's welcome news that the Fleet Solid support ships will now be built in Britain. Can the Secretary of State assure us that it will be British steel that is used exclusively to build these ships?
Secretary of State.
All I can say at this moment in time is we're engaging, obviously, with potential bidders, and we will make sure we get to build a ship that is the best of British, but also incorporates the best of capabilities that we can deliver, A, for the money, but also for our armed forces.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend outline what support the military is giving to increase NHS bed capacity and what plans there are to do that further?
Secretary of State.
At the beginning of the outbreak of COVID, the military were deeply engaged in the rollout, building and indeed running of the COVID Nightingale hospitals, including using reserve medics to transfer from the NHS, obviously, into some of that service. We'll continue to review that. We are working inside the Department of Health and Social Care as we speak to see what needs they require. Where they do require them, I stand by to deliver them.
We now come to Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Fishermen working in Scapa Flow occasionally still dredge up
ordnance left there from the end of the Second World War. My constituent Ian Spence did exactly that in January this year. For the loss of a day's fishing, damage to his gear, and indeed the personal danger in which he was put, he was given an ex gratia payment of £228. Can the Secretary of State explain to me and to him why he considers that to be adequate?
Secretary of State.
No, I'll have to look at the detail of that case, and I'll be happy to write to him. Obviously, compensation and liability is obviously linked to at some stages who is at fault, and I will definitely make sure I furnish him with the details.
We now come to Emma Lulberg, who was the last question, didn't get it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The changing of contracts at HM Naval Base on the Clyde as part of the Future Maritime Support Programme is an exercise in outsourcing. It will lead to job cuts, weaker terms and conditions, and create an unnecessary operational risk to our UK defence capabilities. Why is the Secretary of State doing this?
Minister.
I think the Honourable Lady, Mr. Speaker, is referring to the change from one outsourcing contract to another outsourcing contract, and we've gained a lot for the taxpayer from the existing contract. Hopefully, more will will be driven out in the future. We'll do nothing that could endanger national security.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order! Order. Before I call the Prime Minister, I wish to make a short statement. I regret that the main elements of the Prime Minister's statement were announced over the weekend. I understand that the statement was due to be made today, but was brought forward due to the leaks to the media. After speaking with the Prime Minister and Leader of the House, who went to great lengths to reassure me that the leaks were not from Downing Street, I expect the Prime Minister to keep the House updated on this leak inquiry. I also hope that if the leaker is identified, and if a member of this House, that member will make a full apology to the House of the discourteous and unacceptable behaviour. I would also like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation for this statement is available to watch on the Parliamentary Live TV. Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will make a statement on the measures we must now take to contain the autumn surge of coronavirus, protect our NHS and save lives. On Saturday evening, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor described the remorseless advance of this second wave. The extraordinary efforts being made by millions of people across the country, especially by those in very high alert areas, have made a real difference, suppressing the R rate below where it would otherwise have been. But the R is still above 1 in every part of England, as it is across much of Europe, and the virus is spreading even faster than the reasonable worst-case scenario. There are already more COVID patients in some hospitals now than at the height of the first wave. 2,000 more this Sunday than last Sunday. While the prevalence of the virus is worse in parts of the north, the doubling time in the southeast and the Midlands is now faster than in the northwest. Even in the southwest, where incidence remains low, current projections mean they will start to run out of hospital capacity in a matter of weeks. And the modelling presented by our scientists suggests that without action we could see up to twice as many deaths over the winter as we saw in the first wave. Faced with these latest figures, there is no alternative but to take further action at a national level. I believe it was right to try every possible option to get this virus under control at a local level with strong local action and strong local leadership. And I reject any suggestion that we are somehow slower in taking measures than our European friends and partners. In fact, we're moving to national measures when the rate both of deaths and infections, for instance, is lower than they were in France. We are engaged as a country in a constant struggle to protect lives and livelihoods, and we must balance the restrictions we introduce against the long-term scars they leave, whether for businesses and jobs or our physical and mental health. No one wants to impose measures unless absolutely essential, so it made sense to focus initially on the areas where the disease was surging and not to shut businesses, pubs and restaurants in parts of the country where incidence was low. I want to thank the millions who have put up with local restrictions, sometimes for months on end. I want to thank them and the local leaders who have understood the gravity of the position. And we will continue as far as possible to adopt a pragmatic and local approach in the months ahead. But we are fighting a disease, Mr. Speaker. When the data changes course, we must change course too. And to those in this House who believe we should resist further national measures, let me spell out the medical and moral disaster we face. If we allow our health system to be overwhelmed, exactly as the data now suggests, then that would not only be a disaster for thousands of COVID patients, because their survival rates would fall, we would also reach a point where the NHS was no longer there for everyone. The sick would be turned away because there was no room in our hospitals. That sacred principle of care for anyone who needs it, whoever they are, and wherever, whenever they need it, could be broken for the first time in our lives. Doctors and nurses could be forced to choose which patients to treat, who would live and who would die. And this existential threat to our NHS comes not from focusing too much on coronavirus, but from not focusing enough. If we fail to get coronavirus under control, it is the sheer weight of demand from COVID patients that would deprive others of the care they need. Cancer treatment, heart surgery, other life-saving procedures, all this could be put at risk if we do not get the virus under control. And even though we are so much better prepared than before, with stockpiles of PPE and ventilators, the Nightingales on standby and 13,000 more nurses than last year, I'm afraid the virus is doubling faster than we could conceivably add capacity. Even if we doubled capacity, the gain would be consumed in a single doubling of the virus. And so on Wednesday, the House will vote on regulations which, if passed, will mean that from Thursday until the 2nd of December in England, people will only be permitted to leave home for specific reasons, including for education, for work if you cannot work from home, for exercise and recreation outdoors, with your household or on your own, or with one person from another household or support bubble, for medical reasons, appointments, and to escape injury and harm, to shop for food and essentials, and to provide care for vulnerable people or as a volunteer. Essential shops will remain open and click and collect services will continue, so people do not need to stock up. But I'm afraid that non-essential shops, leisure and entertainment venues and the personal care sector will all be closed. Hospitality must close except for takeaway and delivery services. Places of worship can open for individual prayer, funerals and formal childcare, but sadly not for services. However, Remembrance Sunday events can go ahead, provided they are held outside and observe social distancing. Workplaces should stay open where people can't work from home, for example, in construction or manufacturing. Elite sport will also be able to continue. Single adult households can still form exclusive support bubbles with one other household, and children will still be able to move between homes if their parents are separated. The clinically vulnerable and those over 60 should minimise their contact with others. And while we will not ask people to shield again in the same way, the clinically extremely vulnerable should only work from home. Mr. Speaker, I am truly sorry for the anguish these measures will impose, particularly for businesses which have just got back on their feet. Businesses across the country who have gone to such trouble to make themselves COVID secure, to install perspex screens, to do the right thing. Each of these actions, Mr. Speaker, has helped to bring the R down, and their hard work, your hard work, will stand them in good stead, will stand you in good stead, but it is now clear that we must do more together. So the government will continue to do everything possible to support jobs and livelihoods in the next 4 weeks, as we have throughout. We've protected almost 10 million jobs with furlough, and we're now extending the scheme throughout November. We've already paid out £13.7 billion to help the self-employed. And I can announce today that for November, we will double our support from 40 to 80% of trading profits. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will also extend the deadline for applications to COVID loan schemes from the end of this month to the end of next, to ensure that small businesses can have access to additional loans if required. We are not going back to the full-scale lockdown of March and April, and there are ways in which these measures are less prohibitive. We have, for instance, a moral duty to keep schools open now, that it is safe to do so, because we must not let this virus damage our children's futures. So schools will remain open, colleges, universities, childcare and early years settings. And I am pleased that this will command support, Mr. Speaker, across this House. It's also vital that we continue provision for non-COVID healthcare, so people should turn up to use the NHS, to get their scans, turn up for appointments and collect treatments. Mr. Speaker, let me stress that these restrictions are time limited. After 4 weeks, on Wednesday the 2nd of December, they will expire, and we intend to return to a tiered system on a local and regional basis according to the latest data and trends, and the House will have a vote to agree the way forward. We have updated the devolved administrations on the action we're taking in England, and will continue to work with them on plans for Christmas and beyond. And while scientists are bleak in their predictions over the short term, they are unanimously optimistic about the medium and the long term. And if the House asks me, Mr. Speaker, what is the exit strategy, what is the way out, let me be as clear as I can. The way out is to get the R down now, to beat this autumn surge, and to use this moment to exploit the medical and technical advances we are making to keep it low. We now have not only the much better medication, the prospect of a vaccine, we have the immediate prospect of many millions of cheap, reliable and rapid turnaround tests with a result in minutes. Trials have already shown that we can help suppress the disease in hospitals, schools and universities by testing large numbers of NHS workers, children, teachers and students. These tests, crucially, identify people who are infectious but who do not have symptoms, allowing them immediately to self-isolate and stop the spread of the disease, and allowing those who are not infectious to continue as normal. This means that, unlike the spring, it's possible to keep these institutions open and still stop the spread of the disease. And so over the next few days and weeks, we plan a steady but massive expansion in the deployment of these quick turnaround tests, which we will be manufacturing in this country, applying them in an ever-growing number of situations, from helping women to have their partners with them in labour wards when they're giving birth, to testing whole towns and even cities. The army has been brought in to work on the logistics, and the programme will begin in a matter of days. Mr. Speaker, we have dexamethasone, the first validated life-saving treatment for the disease, pioneered in this country. We have the real prospect of a vaccine, as I say, in the first quarter of next year. And we have ever more sophisticated means of providing virtually instant tests. I believe that these technical developments, taken together, will enable us to defeat the virus by the spring, as humanity has defeated every other infectious disease, and I am not alone in this optimism. But I cannot pretend that the way ahead is easy or without painful choices for us all. And so for the next 4 weeks, I must again ask the people of this country to come together to protect the NHS and to save many thousands of lives. And Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for his call on Saturday to brief me on developments? Mr. Speaker, the central lesson from the first wave of this virus was that if you don't act early and decisively, the cost will be far worse. More people will lose their jobs, more businesses will be forced to close, and tragically, more people will lose their loved ones. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor failed to learn this lesson. As a result, this lockdown will be longer than it needed to be, at least 4 weeks. It will be harder. We've just missed half term, and the human cost will be higher. On the 21st of September, when the government's own scientist, SAGE, recommended an urgent 2 to 3 week circuit break, there were 11 deaths from COVID-19 and just over 4,000 COVID infections. For 40 days, the Prime Minister ignored that advice. And when he finally announced a longer and deeper national lockdown on Saturday, those figures had increased to 326 deaths a day and 22,000 COVID cases. That, Mr. Speaker, is the human cost of the government's inaction. The reality is that the two pillars of the Prime Minister's strategy, the £12 billion track and trace and regional restrictions, have not only failed to stop the second wave, they've been swept away by it. At every stage, the Prime Minister has been too slow, behind the curve. At every stage, he's pushed away challenge, ignored advice, and put what he hoped would happen ahead of what is happening. At every stage, he's overpromised and underdelivered. Rejecting the advice of his own scientists for 40 days was a catastrophic failure of leadership and of judgment. The Prime Minister now needs to explain to the British people why he failed to act and to listen for so long. But tougher national restrictions are now needed. The virus is out of control, and the cost of further inaction would be huge. So Labour will provide the votes necessary to make this happen. But we will also demand that the government doesn't waste these 4 weeks and repeat past mistakes. So can the Prime Minister answer some very simple and direct questions. Will the government finally use this period to fix the broken track and trace system and give control to local authorities, as we've proposed for months? We all agree that schools should be kept open. So will the Prime Minister finally put in place the additional testing, support and strategy needed to make this happen? Will the Prime Minister confirm that the new economic package, I think it will be the Chancellor's fourth in 5 weeks, will be at least as generous as in March? And despite the partial step he announced today, will he go further to close the gaping holes in support for the self-employed? And will there be further support for the 1 million people who've already lost their jobs since March? How does the Prime Minister plan to get a grip on messaging and rebuild public trust? After all, Mr. Speaker, this announcement is only happening today because it was leaked to the national papers before it came to Parliament. And finally, can he clarify what the process will be for exiting lockdown? Will it be only when the national R rate is below 1, or will some regions exit lockdown before others? I noticed the Prime Minister did not make this clear in his statement. This really matters because even before this national lockdown, millions of people have been living under restrictions for months. Leicester, for example, is on day 127. And after everything the British people have been through and are being asked to sacrifice again, they need confidence that the government actually has a plan, that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Mr. Speaker, I know how difficult this next month will be, and the months to come. The lockdown will be harder, longer and more damaging than it needed to be. And now, more than ever, we must stand together as a country, as families and as communities, and show once again that at a moment of national crisis, the British people always rise to the moment and support those in need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for supporting these measures, and I think he's right to do so. But I make absolutely no apology, whatever, for doing my level best, our level best as a government, to avoid going back into a national lockdown with all the damage that entails for people's livelihoods, for people's mental health, for jobs across this country. And that was, Mr. Speaker, our intention. And it is absolutely true, as the House has learnt today and has seen, that the virus has risen across the whole of much of Northern Europe, and that doesn't mean, Mr. Speaker, that it was wrong to go for a local approach, and it doesn't mean that it was wrong to support NHS test and trace, because actually both those approaches, both those means have done a fantastic job in their way of bringing the virus under control, of reducing the R. It's lower than it would have been without those heroic local efforts, and it's lower than it would have been without NHS test and trace. And he should, in my view, he should stop continually knocking NHS test and trace, because we need people to self-isolate. And if there is one criticism that I accept many criticisms, but the one thing I do think that we need to get right is we need to see people self-isolating to a greater extent than they currently are. And it would be good if people across this House could therefore back and support NHS test and trace, because it is absolutely vital. Turning to some of the points that the right honourable gentleman made. Yes, it is absolutely true that we are going to protect schools particularly, and we're massively expanding testing for schools. I mentioned earlier on in my remarks about what mass testing can do for particular institutions, schools, hospitals, universities and others. He asked about help for the economy, for businesses and for the self-employed. And he perhaps didn't hear what I said, that we are massively increasing help for the self-employed and will continue to support businesses and livelihoods across this country. And I once again thank my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for the creativity that he brings to these problems. He asked when these measures would end. And they will end, Mr. Speaker, they will end, as I've told the House already, they will end on December the 2nd. And the House has the right to decide and will vote on whatever measures it chooses to bring in. But we will then go back to the tiered system based on the data as it presents itself. Mr. Speaker, he asks the people of this country to stand together against the coronavirus, and I couldn't agree with him more. And all I may respectfully say is that I think the people of this country would also like to see the politicians of this country standing together a little bit more coherently in the face of this virus.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, the impact of the pandemic goes well beyond COVID patients to all parts of the NHS, to the economy and to our personal and social well-being. Does my right honourable friend agree that for this House to be able to determine across all parts of government that decisions have been taken on the best available evidence, that a new parliamentary committee, perhaps time-limited or made up of privy councillors, should be established to reassure the British public that through this committee that the cure is not worse than the disease?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for the very interesting suggestion that he makes. I must tell him that throughout the pandemic, individual departmental select committees have been, as well as the liaison committee, have shown that they're more than capable of scrutinising these issues. But I leave it up to the House to decide what arrangements it chooses to make.
We're heading up to the Leader of the SNP in Scotland, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is right that the UK government extends furlough as a consequence of the new lockdown measures. It is right that economic support is put in place when governments restrain work opportunities as a consequence of the health measures. It is right that this flexibility to take necessary financial decisions is also held by the devolved administrations when they are taking lockdown decisions. That's why, since the start of September, I've asked the Prime Minister on no less than 6 separate occasions to extend the furlough scheme, and yet every time the Prime Minister rejected that call. Mr. Speaker, this weekend's last-minute U-turn on furlough has finally buried the nonsense of a union of equals, because people across these islands saw exactly what happened at the weekend. A mini extension to furlough was only granted at the 11th hour when one part of the United Kingdom needed it. This is a democratic disgrace. The Prime Minister only acted when England needed support. When Scotland needed full furlough support, Westminster said no. Mr. Speaker, for many, this U-turn is already far too late. Thousands have already lost their jobs unnecessarily. Many good businesses have gone under, and millions of the self-employed are still excluded. So today, Mr. Speaker, I have one very direct question for the Prime Minister. If requested by the devolved governments, particularly if they need to put in place additional lockdown measures, will the Prime Minister guarantee that the Treasury will make 80% furlough payments available when Scottish, Welsh or Northern Irish workers or businesses need it over the coming months? It is a simple question, Prime Minister, and for once, give us a straight answer to a question that the people of Scotland want to know. No more ducking and diving. Is it yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the answer is yes, because the furlough scheme is a UK-wide scheme, and it applies across the whole of the UK. And it is true that Scotland is currently taking a slightly different approach, but I thought he was talking complete nonsense about the non-application of furlough in Scotland. Absolute nonsense. The Treasury of this country, the United Kingdom, has supplied £7.2 billion to support the people of Scotland, and quite right too, and it has protected 900,000 jobs in Scotland. That is thanks to the might of the UK Treasury.
Sir Charles Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will not be supporting the government's legislation on Wednesday because as we drift further into an authoritarian, coercive state, the only legal mechanism left open to me is to vote against that legislation. That is all we've got left, Mr. Speaker. If my constituents protest, they get arrested. Given that the people of this country will never, ever forgive the political class for criminalising parents seeing children and children seeing parents, does the Prime Minister not agree with me? Now is the time for a written constitution that guarantees the fundamental rights of our constituents, a constitution underpinned and enforced by the Supreme Court.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think what the people of this country want, rather than delectable disputations on a written constitution, is to defeat the coronavirus. But, and that's why I think that overwhelmingly they understand the need for these measures, and they understand the need for us to come together as a country and get the R down in the way that we're proposing.
Ed David. In confirming Liberal Democrats will back this new lockdown, can I tell the Prime Minister we will hold his government to account for failing to listen to the scientists, refusing to lock down weeks ago, and costing many more lives? Mr. Speaker, throughout this pandemic, many people have been let down by this government. The excluded self-employed, students, key workers. But I want to ask the Prime Minister what one particular group that's been forgotten: unpaid carers. Many carers have been struggling for months, often relying on food banks as they care for other people. So will the Prime Minister follow the advice of Carers UK, increase carers allowance by £20 a week, the same rises for universal credit, and give these incredible people a lifeline?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to carers, unpaid carers in particular, for everything they've done to keep this country going throughout the pandemic. I'll look at the proposal that he makes, but I would just remind him of the colossal interventions that we've already made, worth 200 billion to support jobs and to support livelihoods across the whole of the UK. We will continue, as I say, to put our arms around the people of this country.
Ed Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wrekin and Radnorshire has around 50 miles of the border between Wales and England. My constituents, who are already in lockdown, regularly travel across the border for work, healthcare and education. Can my right honourable friend confirm that essential travel across the border is not only permitted, it is encouraged, and that the Welsh Government should not be using this pandemic to create artificial barriers between Wales and England?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, well, I understand the frustrations that my honourable friend has, and I know how deeply difficult it is for people throughout this country to go through the restrictions on our normal way of life that we have and that we're asking people to do again. And I apologise to her and to the House for what we're obliged to do, but we must ask people, unless it's absolutely necessary, to stay at home and stop transmission of the virus. And that applies throughout the UK.
Samuel Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, we were promised a Churchillian response to this virus, but rather than a Churchillian response, we've had a response more like Lord Halifax, because while we've had the rhetoric of defiance, this announcement today really is an announcement of defeat. We've surrendered our freedoms, we've surrendered our economy, we have driven people to despair with daily doses of doom-laden data. Can he promise us that once we get past this latest lockdown, that if there's another upsurge, we're not going to get a bout of the same destructive medicine, but we will get a policy which allows this country and individuals to run their own lives and not be ruled by this virus?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I sympathise very much with the sentiments that he expresses about the loss of freedom and people's frustrations, and I do understand that. But I must say that I think that what the people of the country want to see is this virus brought down. They want to see a reduction in the infection rate, and alas, at the moment, this is the best tool we have to do that when you look at the whole national picture. But I am optimistic when I look at the scientific interventions that we have coming down the track. And even the medical and scientific advisors, who are not normally, Mr. Speaker, full of cheer on this matter, are optimistic when they consider the therapies, the prospect of a vaccine, and the prospect of mass testing of a kind that I've outlined to the House.
Let's head to Essex with Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement? And whilst I accept that we do need to do something to ensure hospitalisations are controlled and that the R rate falls, can my right honourable friend please review the regulations around socially distanced outdoor sports, such as golf and tennis, as these are good forms of exercise for all ages and present very little risk of infection?
Prime Minister.
Well, I sympathise again, Mr. Speaker, with the point that my honourable friend makes, and I'm glad he makes it. All I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that honourable members should get onto the website. Members of the public should get onto the website and look at exactly what is permitted. But the reality is that we have to stop. We have to break the transmission of the disease, and that's why I'm afraid I must tell with great sadness, I'm going to tell my honourable friends, we have to make these restrictions for the next 4 weeks. And I bitterly regret it, but it's what we've got to do.
Let's head to Meirionydd with Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz Saville-Roberts.
We've learnt so much since spring, Mr. Speaker. We've learnt that we're expected to act grateful in Wales. We've learned that the Treasury is only there for us when the home counties of England go into lockdown. A casual dismissal of devolution that costs people their jobs. The news simply came too late. He may not have noticed yet, but the Prime Minister and his Chancellor are fronting a membership drive for the independence movement Yes Cymru, who added 2,000 members in 2 days this weekend. Would he accept my grateful thanks?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm always grateful for any kindness from the Right Honourable Lady, but I can tell her that, generally speaking, our cooperation with the government in administration in Cardiff has been excellent, and I've no doubt will continue to be so.
We now come to David Davis.
Thank you, Speaker. The Prime Minister is clearly and quite properly trying to do everything possible to cut infections and deaths from COVID-19. To that end, over the weekend, a number of eminent scientists called on the government to try to resolve the vitamin D deficiency issues in the United Kingdom to reduce the severity of the pandemic. There have been dozens of studies over hundreds of countries in the last 6 months which show, or imply anyway, that this could reduce the infection rates by half and the death rates by half again, the case death rates by half again. The Scottish Government is now sending 4 months' supply of vitamin D to everybody who's shielded in Scotland. Given its low cost and there is no medical downside, could our government consider the same approach in England?
Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. He's entirely right that we are indeed looking at the possible beneficial effects of vitamin D, and I know that we'll be updating the House shortly.
We now go down to Brighton to Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extending support for the self-employed is welcome, but it does nothing for the over 3 million self-employed and freelancers who've been unfairly left out of previous schemes and are still excluded. Huge numbers of those working in the arts and hospitality in my Brighton constituency, for example. Will he look at that again, and will he take one small but simple step that would help? Will he acknowledge that the minimum income floor under universal credit discriminates against anyone with an unpredictable and variable income? And will he delay its impending reintroduction?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the Right Honourable Lady that we are supporting the answers she knows with a £1.57 billion package. They're vital for our country. They're massively important to the UK economy. And her point about the minimum income floor for universal credit is one that the government well understands, and we are looking at actively at the moment.
Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for the bitter medicine that he's had to deliver over the last 2 or 3 days, and can I assure him that I will support his measures, because nobody has put forward a viable, immediate alternative that would avoid the overwhelming of the NHS. But what can my right honourable friend do to strengthen public confidence in the government's COVID response? He started today to set out some of the features of what might be called a plan for living with coronavirus, a combination of vaccines and testing and tracking and tracing. Would he consider setting that out in a white paper? And would that include transformation of not just the logistics of test, track and trace, but of the leadership of test, track and trace, so that they can run a coherent and viable campaign to change the behaviour by consent and cooperation and get compliance and public confidence in that programme? And finally, will he publish more of the analysis and data behind the decisions he's had to take so that people can understand why the government is making these decisions more clearly, and there will be more transparency and accountability?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for all his excellent suggestions. We're certainly happy to publish all the data, and I've tried to set out to the House earlier on, Mr. Speaker, our plan for the way forward, and he's absolutely correct that it does rely on not just getting the virus down now in this 4-week period. That's the objective, but also to ensure that we make the maximum possible use of the various scientific developments, not just the vaccine and new therapies, but, as he says, improved testing. And I can certainly assure him that the military will be closely involved.
Corinne Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Bristol South did everything asked of them. They obeyed the rules, a great personal sacrifice. And now they've been asked to do it again because of his government's failure. Trust is absolutely now at rock bottom. So to rebuild that trust, his two key planks are around test and trace and the tier system. Firstly, he needs to sack Baroness Harding. I know she's a friend. I know it's difficult, but it's clearly been a failure and needs to give that £12 billion resource back to the experts on the local ground who know how to use it and to support people isolating. And secondly, he's going to return to the tier system. That's all we know about what happens on December the 3rd. What is the real plan? If the tier system has worked, Bristol is currently in tier 1. Are we to expect Bristolians to return to tier 1 on December the 3rd?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, again, NHS test and trace, whatever the drawbacks, whatever the frustrations that people legitimately feel, it will achieve its target for 500,000 capacity by the end of October. It already has achieved that target, and I think that's a considerable thing to have done. I thank everybody working in NHS test and trace for their efforts. As I say, we need people to self-isolate to give the system the effectiveness that it needs. And I can tell her that when we come to the 2nd of December, the tier that areas go into will depend very much on the effectiveness with which we've all followed the instructions that we're giving today. And that is the guidance she should give her constituents.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, lockdown is a necessary evil and comes with a lot of pain. But like the member for South Basildon earlier, many of my constituents in Bracknell have contacted me to express concern about the effective closure of gymnasiums, golf clubs and tennis clubs. Given the proven benefits of exercise and the lack of any clear evidence that these activities have contributed to an increase in the R rate, might the Prime Minister be willing to reconsider the current guidance within the next 4 weeks?
Minister.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, I must apologise to my honourable friend for not being able to offer the House a huge list of exemptions to the rules that we're setting out, because once you unpick at one thing, alas, the effectiveness of the whole package is compromised. But that's why I want everybody to work together for the next 4 weeks, as I say, to get the R under control so that we can open things up again in time for December.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. What is the Prime Minister and Chancellor's estimate of the additional economic cost of implementing this second lockdown now for 4 weeks or possibly more in the run-up to Christmas, compared to implementing it for 2 weeks when SAGE first recommended it back on the 21st of September?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Chief Medical Officer said, I think on Saturday night there is no right time to put businesses to close, pubs and restaurants. We don't. No government wants to do that, and we hope very much that this limited 4-week action will get the R down, and I think it is greatly to be preferred to a rolling series of lockdowns of the kind that I believe were being proposed.
Long may is clear for Bob Blackman. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend in particular for laying out the scientific data on which this decision is based. Most people will say we are prepared, obviously, to do the right thing in order to eliminate and defeat this virus. But could he set out the criteria that he will use to ensure that we can come out of this partial lockdown on December the 2nd, because the risk is that things could get worse over these next 2 or 3 weeks before we see an improvement. And people want to know what it is they have to do to make sure that we get the infection rate down and make sure it stays down.
Prime Minister.
Just to repeat the point that I think I made to the right honourable gentleman opposite, the R is above 1, but it is not much above 1. It is not much above 1. And if we work hard between now and the 2nd of December, I believe that we can get it below 1. But whatever happens, Mr. Speaker, these restrictions end on the 2nd of December, and any further measures will be a matter for this House of Commons.
Heading to Lewisham with Janet Davey. Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What plans will be put in place to address spiralling waiting lists for cancer services, and what additional support is the government giving to the many thousands of people that have had their cancer treatment disrupted due to the pandemic?
Prime Minister.
She makes an excellent point, and it's precisely to protect cancer services, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that non-COVID patients do get access to the treatment that we need, that we have to put in the package of measures that we've announced today.
Let's head down to Newbury with Laura Farris. Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that the data leaves the government with no choice but to enter a national lockdown. But given the huge consequences that this entails, can my right honourable friend give assurances that the new tools that are at his disposal, and particularly the 15-minute tests, will be sufficiently ubiquitous and effective in the coming weeks to avoid any future national lockdown after November?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that is certainly the intention, and that's why we're massively ramping up the tests in the way that she describes.
Patrick Reddy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. His furlough is in place until December. The German equivalent is in place until December 2021. That's the kind of certainty that employers and employees in Glasgow North are looking for. So he said that furlough is UK-wide. So does that mean that if parts of the United Kingdom are still in a lockdown beyond December, that devolved administrations will have the resources they need to extend the 80% furlough? Yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he must have missed my answer to the leader of his group, the Scottish Nationalist Party, and I can tell him that the furlough is a UK-wide scheme. It applies throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. And just to remind him, the UK has already contributed £7.2 billion to Scotland to support Scotland, the people of Scotland, throughout the crisis.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask my right honourable friend before Wednesday to publish a full impact assessment setting out the cost of the lockdown in terms of jobs that will be lost, businesses that will fail, and the enormous toll on people's mental and other aspects of their health, the lives that will be lost as a result of lockdown, as well as those that we hope to save?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there are many estimates of the economic impact that the country has already sustained, many projections of the losses in employment that we, alas, expect. But against them, we must set the tragic loss of life that would inevitably ensue if this House failed to act on Wednesday.
We're heading up to Merseyside with Bill Esterson. Bill Esterson.
It's been 33 weeks since the start of the first lockdown. In that time, 1 in 20 people who are a part of the working population have had no work, but also have been ineligible for furlough, ineligible for the self-employed financial support, and ineligible for the business grants and loans. So what is the Prime Minister's message to the millions of people who've had no financial support about how they should put food on the table for their families?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to him because he raises a very important point. We've put another £9 billion into the welfare system, principally by uprating universal credit, and that will go through to next year, as he knows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This lockdown since March has been devastating for so many people, and only very reluctantly will I be supporting the latest lockdown measures when they come to this House on Wednesday. But does my right honourable friend agree with me that the real problem here is for people's mental health, whether it's elderly people who are in care homes or who are desperately missing their families around them, whether it's business people who are seeing their life's efforts just ruined around them, and also, of course, for families with very young children who are so isolated and frankly miserable. So will my right honourable friend please do everything possible to make sure that this lockdown is a compassionate one, and that wherever possible we make sure that support for those who are vulnerable and with mental health problems will be supported through it?
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we put another £12 billion into supporting mental health care. But the general point she makes is very important, and it's one of the reasons why no government wants to impose these measures lightly, and why we want to make sure that we get through them as fast as we can.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister quite rightly spoke of the importance of strong local action and strong local leadership, but he needs to acknowledge that his dithering and delay and the lack of communication has made local leaders' job far more difficult. Will he and the Chancellor now commit today to talk to the core cities to assess the actual economic impact of lockdown on their cities, and in the first instance the need for a winter support package to tackle issues such as rough sleeping, food poverty, and, as the Right Honourable Lady just said, mental health?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. We're in constant contact with government, regional, local, at all city, at all levels throughout this country to protect and to help them protect and support our constituents, and we've given about £3.7 billion to local councils, and we will continue to support local government throughout the crisis.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. It's important that Parliament should have the chance to scrutinise the scientific advice behind these recommendations. So I'm grateful to Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Whitty for agreeing to appear before the Science and Technology Committee tomorrow. But will my right honourable friend confirm that it's his policy to have the minimum level of restrictions on businesses and people in every place consistent with the need to avoid overwhelming the NHS?
Well, that's the policy very accurately summed up, Mr. Speaker. But for better elucidation and understanding of it, I really do urge people to get onto the website and see exactly what they need to do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I accept the need for extra restrictions in order to get on top of the R rate and bring it down. But it is disturbing that the government don't seem to have any specific targets that they seek to achieve through this lockdown. So when we have the debate on Wednesday, will the government be coming back with specific targets that it wants to achieve by the 2nd of December?
Mr. Speaker, these measures are time limited. They elapse on the 2nd of December. But I repeat, the objective is to get the disease to stop doubling, the infection rate to stop doubling, and to start halving. To do that, you need to get the R down below 1. It's currently estimated to be between 1.1 and 1.3. I think the ONS said recently it was 1.6, but it has been coming down. Our intention is to use this period to get it below 1 and get that infection rate halving, not doubling.
Good person.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unlike some northern mayors who are playing a dangerous game of trying to divide the country along geographical lines, can I say to the Prime Minister, remind him that there are lots of leaders in the north of England, including those in my area, who want to work with the government to defeat this virus and won't run off to the nearest TV studio once they've engaged in that partnership with the government. But can I push him on the issue of mental health? This is causing particular issues around anxiety for many people. Will he ensure that therapists such as talking therapies and those charities that work with us who have anxiety conditions will be properly funded throughout this whole process?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and he will have seen that there are specific exemptions for volunteers and people helping for therapists and others, and we continue to put many millions of support into mental health charities in addition to supporting NHS mental health.
Heading up to Manchester with Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When local leaders asked the government to maintain the furlough scheme at 80% when Tier 3 restrictions were imposed across much of the Northwest, Northeast, and the West Midlands, they refused. Instead, the lowest paid Northerners were told a 67% wage subsidy was sufficient for them. When similar restrictions were extended to the rest of England over the weekend, the Chancellor appears to have changed his mind, shaken the magic money tree, and returned to 80%. Does the Prime Minister understand why the North believe they are being treated with utter contempt? And can he now confirm that the government will maintain an 80% wage subsidy for any ongoing Tier 3 restrictions after the national lockdown is lifted?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the crucial point here is that the measures that we're enacting today, or I hope the House will vote through on Wednesday, are very different from the Tier 3 measures, and therefore the package of support is appropriately different as well.
Andy Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Small businesses across the North West have been operating under significant restrictions for some time, and I've seen for myself the ingenuity and the creativity that business owners have adapted to as they've also reported weak demand and reduced cash reserves. Many of them are looking forward to the run-up to Christmas for some relief. Can my right honourable friend outline the measures to protect livelihoods and secure jobs in the North West and Warrington South?
Well, I'm grateful to the people of Warrington for everything they've done, and I know that they've had a very tough time. It's been tough to control the disease there, as it has been across many parts of the country, and they've done a great job in bringing the R down. I do think that there is the prospect of a much brighter future ahead if we can make a success of these national measures, open up again in December, as I say, give people the chance of some shopping, some economic activity in the weeks leading up to Christmas and then beyond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We all know that those who want to break up the United Kingdom love nothing more than a manufactured grievance. But I have to tell the Prime Minister that he does nothing to help those of us who want the United Kingdom to stay together when he is the one manufacturing the grievances. His position in relation to the future access to furlough funds for Scotland and other devolved administrations is unfair and untenable, and it has to change. And he doesn't need to take my word for it. He can ask his own honourable friend from Murray, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, because he takes exactly the same view.
But, Mr. Speaker, I must respectfully remind the right honourable gentleman of what I've said repeatedly throughout this afternoon. The furlough scheme is UK-wide. It will continue to apply in Scotland. Of course it will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for his statement. And I do take note of his answers to my honourable friends from South Basildon and East Thurrock and from Bracknell. But there are outdoor recreational activities, such as swimming at the Beccles Lido, that can take place in a socially distanced and responsible way. And I'll just urge him to reflect on that. And can he also ensure that indoor leisure and hospitality businesses that are required to close will receive the necessary support to get them and their staff through this crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in all intellectual humility, we will look at all the suggestions that are being made by honourable members across the House. We will look at any exceptions that we can sensibly make. I just go back to the point that I made earlier on. It is very difficult to take out one part of the Jenga block without disturbing the whole package. But I hear what he says, and I can certainly assure him that indoor as well as outdoor businesses will certainly be receiving support.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement today? Prime Minister, I understand that there will be a Barnett consequential for Northern Ireland, and I welcome this commitment by government to that. But can I ask the Prime Minister to recognise that the closure of many sectors in England has a massive effect and impact across the United Kingdom, and in particular, given that so many companies in Northern Ireland supply the English market, and therefore UK-wide supports are needed. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what's extra support, or what will there be for the Barnett Consequential for Northern Ireland?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and we're making sure that people across the whole of the UK get the support that they need. I think things have been tough in Northern Ireland lately, and I think the overall package has been worth about £2.4 billion so far, but obviously there will be more to come.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly support these painful measures, and the Prime Minister's transparent reluctance to take away people's liberties will reassure many people that they are absolutely necessary. It won't surprise him that I want to ask him about the testing of NHS staff. In July, Chris Whitty told the Select Committee that he supported regular testing of NHS staff if there was a surge. We now have that surge, but less than half of NHS trusts are testing on a weekly basis all their staff. So will he reassure NHS staff they're not infecting their own patients, reassure cancer patients that it is safe to go into hospitals, reassure the country that the NHS is not going to become a COVID-only service by saying that when we start this new lockdown, we will also start weekly testing of all NHS staff?
Mr. Speaker, we are rolling out testing of all NHS staff as fast as we possibly can, and we're all too aware of the risk of nosocomial infection of the kind that we saw last time. One of the things we're doing this time, Mr. Speaker, is greatly expanding the use of novel mass testing devices such as the LAMP technology, which I'm sure he's familiar with in NHS settings. But where we want to get to, Mr. Speaker, as I told the House earlier on, is a world in which we're testing these particularly vulnerable institutions, hospitals, care homes, schools, universities, with regular mass lateral flow testing of the kind that I've described.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Participation in sport is vital for our nation's physical and mental health. Now, the Prime Minister on Saturday night at his press conference triumphantly announced that the Premier League would continue, but his announcement today means that local amateur football will not be able to continue. Golf clubs and gyms are going to be closed, despite their valiant efforts to ensure that they're COVID safe. So can I ask the Prime Minister to publish the specific scientific data behind these set of decisions?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to provide all the scientific data on which these decisions have been made, but I think what the House will appreciate is that for any particular human activity, you can always find an arguable exemption from these measures, or for many of them. The difficulty is that to be consistent and to have a package that works, you need to have a thoroughgoing series of measures of the kind that we have described. I bitterly regret that we have to curtail for 28 days football clubs and sporting activities in the way that we are. I bitterly regret it. But that is, I believe, necessary to get the R down.
Let's head to Central Devon with Mel Stride. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This lockdown will inevitably have very serious consequences for our economy and for the livelihoods of millions of people up and down our country, and for many, many years to come. My right honourable friend has rightly stated that he does not wish to see the NHS overwhelmed, but equally, Mr. Speaker, we do not wish to see our UK economy overwhelmed either. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that perhaps we need a more balanced debate about lockdown, involving both scientists and economists more prominently? And with that in mind, would he consider perhaps the government's chief economic advisor or similar economic expert joining government scientific experts for number 10 press briefings?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I'm not sure that I want to put the government's chief economic advisor through the experience of the press briefings, but we are always aware. We are always aware of the economic consequences and the downsides of what is being, what alas we are forced to do at the moment. That's why it's vital that we work together, get the R down below 1 again. It's only just above 1. I do believe we can do it by the 2nd of December, and then, Mr. Speaker, open up the economy again in the way that I know both he and I would like to see.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small businesses in my constituency of Edinburgh North and Leith and right across the UK are facing permanent closure. Their rainy day funds are exhausted, the personal investments of owners and partners are about to be lost, and the millions of people that they employ are facing redundancy. Will the Prime Minister give a guarantee this will be treated with the same urgency that a UK government treated a threat to the banks a few years ago? And will he commit to directing major cash resources to small enterprises and the self-employed to see them through this? Any recovery will be built on their backs. What will his government do to protect them?
Mr. Speaker, she's completely correct in what she says about the recovery. It will be on the backs of businesses, small, medium-sized businesses up and down the land. That's why we've extended a massive package of support, as she knows, £25,000 grants, bounce-back loans, all the investments that we've made, a total package worth £200 billion. But for those now forced to close by these restrictions, grants of £3,000 and those and £2,100 for those who may not be legally forced to close but are adversely affected, and as she knows, cuts in VAT and deferring of business rates until next year.
I'm pleased in his answer to the Honourable Lady, the Prime Minister has acknowledged the burden on businesses, but independent traders and hospitality venues in Rugby and Bulkington, after a difficult year, were looking forward to the months of November and December and the run-up to Christmas as their peak sales period. Is the Prime Minister confident that the cost to business in losses of turnover and jobs is a price worth paying? And can you reassure them that after this short-term pain, it'll be back to business on the 2nd of December? And may I just ask him, why can't pubs sell takeaway beer to go with their takeaway food?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to him, and I think the answer is again, there's a budget of measures that we need to bring together to get the R down, and alas, when you start unpicking one bit, logically a lot of the rest of it comes out. His fundamental question is the right one. I think the people of this country want to put human life first. They want to save as many lives as possible, and that must be our overriding aim. And it is our overriding aim. But we think that if we enforce these measures properly, and if people self-isolate, if they're contacted in the way that they should, then we can get the R down below 1 in the way that I have described, and we can have businesses able to open up again and to do Christmas business insofar as they possibly can.
Rachel Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows that Luton suppressed the virus by increasing local testing capacity to track and isolate the virus, and a huge effort by our diverse community to do our bit. Yeah. With the virus increasing across the country, what protections will he put in place for Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities who we know are at risk and currently disproportionately represented in ICU admissions?
I'm grateful to the people of Luton for everything that they've done, as I am to everywhere across the country who's worked so hard to get the virus down. It's absolutely true that there are some people, black and minority groups, who are proved particularly vulnerable, and they need enhanced protection, enhanced testing arrangements, which we put in place long ago, and particularly to ensure that people who are working in conditions where they may be more vulnerable to viral load from others get the protection that they need.
Speaker, I've listened carefully and engaged in many detailed briefing sessions about this latest escalation, but to respond to my constituents and echo members across the House, can the Prime Minister give some clarification on the rationale around gym closures and restrictions on places of worship, especially as so many in Harburn and Haslingden have worked extremely hard to make sure that they're COVID secure?
Mr. Speaker, again, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. The rationale is very simple. It is to reduce the overall spread of the virus and to get the R down below 1. That is the rationale.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Charities have been never more needed. And as fundraising opportunities have dried up and retail stores are closing down, charities themselves are predicted to have a £10 billion deficit and yet are providing more and more services. What additional resources will the Prime Minister bring forward to ensure that they can deliver vital services at this time?
Mr. Speaker, I mentioned the support we've already been giving to mental health charities across the country. We will be doing much more over the winter to support the voluntary sector, which is, as she rightly says, does a fantastic job of helping in this crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People and businesses in Birmingham and Padiham have had additional restrictions on them for most of the last 7 months. And whilst everyone is willing to make sacrifices, that is now taking its toll on our local economy. So could the Prime Minister assure me that we won't just make sure the support is in place to get through this next month, but that when it comes to rebuilding our economy, the government will put the same vigour into making sure we build back better? Give them a time deal.
I certainly will, and it's in order to allow the economy to open up again in December that we're taking the steps we are now, but I do believe that this crisis must be met, as he rightly says, with a huge government plan to build back better, which is exactly what we are going to do.
Let's head up to the northwest with Tony Lloyd in Rochdale. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will know that Rochdale, Greater Manchester, large parts of the north have been under some form of restriction now for many, many months. When we come out of this in early December, the one thing the Prime Minister has got to guarantee, and it's something he's not given us today, is not simply that testing will have large numbers, but the trace element of test, track and trace will really work. If it doesn't, he will be letting down the people of Greater Manchester, the sacrifices they've made, and frankly, the whole of the country.
I'm grateful for what he says about the importance of testing. He's right, and the capacity is massively increasing, Mr. Speaker. As I said, up to 500,000. We're now testing more than any other country in Europe. I think 30 million tests have been conducted. But what needs to happen is that those who are contacted need to self-isolate. And Mr. Speaker, we'll be making a big push on that, because at the moment, alas, the proportion, I must be absolutely candid with the House, the proportion of people who are self-isolating in response to the urgings of NHS, test, trace and isolate, is not yet high enough.
Good luck.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend knows very well that the big challenge for lockdown for many people is the loss of agency, the loss of control over their own lives, and the inability, therefore, to control the mental health impacts that follow. He has had to balance, and I understand this difficulty, he has had to balance health today over the implications for health tomorrow. Can I ask him, what is he going to do to encourage agency in local communities, to encourage volunteering, to encourage charities? Because even now, when many people would be getting used to or getting ready to organise Remembrance Sunday services, the government's advice is sadly not up to date today, and I'm sure he will want to put that right so that people can take control of their own lives and actually have agency at this difficult time.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, but I said in my statement earlier that Remembrance Sunday services can go ahead, provided they are socially distanced and outside. And we expressly, Mr. Speaker, and I think he's absolutely right in what he says, we expressly want to encourage volunteering to help others in this difficult time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, 361 beds in Nottingham's hospitals were occupied by COVID patients. That's 40% higher than in April at the peak of the first wave. The Trust has already been forced to cancel operations, and there's still a huge backlog of elective surgeries from the first lockdown. Further cancelled operations will have a very serious impact on some patients' quality of life. But frankly, his dither and delay in Nottingham and going into Tier 2, and going into Tier 3, and now on a national lockdown has made that almost inevitable. What extra support will he provide to Nottingham University Hospitals Trust to ensure that every single one of my constituents who needs healthcare can access it this autumn?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to people in Nottingham for what they're doing. She's absolutely right. It's been a very tough time, but they've been working very hard to get the virus, the infection rate down, and we will continue to support them. Specifically on the NHS, Mr. Speaker, we're making a colossal investment, as she knows, in a £34 billion investment, even before the epidemic hit us, the biggest ever investment in the NHS.
Simon Jupp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cases in the South West remain lower than most of England, although the numbers are heading in the wrong direction. We are well prepared in Devon with the Nightingale Hospital in Exeter. We must take steps to ensure our NHS is not put under severe strain this winter and keep our hospitals open for non-COVID admissions. We have a duty to protect lives and livelihoods, and our local economy is already incredibly fragile. What assurances can the Prime Minister give East Devon that come December the 2nd, without a shred of doubt, the return to regional tiered approach will happen, which reduced the spread and kept businesses going?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you without a shred of doubt that these measures are time limited and expire automatically on the 2nd of December. It will be up to and we will go back into the tiered system depending on the data. He's entirely right in what he says, alas, about the spread at the moment in the southwest. But that will depend on the state of the data at the time, Mr. Speaker.
And then got to Scotland with Carol Monaghan. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the start of the first lockdown, we've been talking about the second wave, and we knew the current trajectory weeks ago. So it beggars belief that the Prime Minister ended up having to make an emergency announcement on Saturday. Devolved nations have now had to wait until infection rates in the southeast of England reached a dangerous level, 5 hours before furlough was due to end, before the Prime Minister took action. So now that he acknowledges we are in the second wave, will he devolve responsibility for furlough to the Scottish Parliament to ensure that we can support individuals and businesses in Scotland when they most need it?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said several times today, Scotland at the moment has a slightly different approach. It retains a tiered approach, but furlough remains a UK scheme and available across the whole country.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Professor Carol Sikora of the University of Buckingham Medical School concluded about the first lockdown, and I quote, "Many seriously ill people stayed at home. They protected the NHS, but it didn't save their lives." This week, with Macmillan reporting up to 50,000 people have an undiagnosed cancer due to COVID restrictions, what reassurances can my right honourable friend give me that if this House does vote for a second lockdown on Wednesday, that the government will do absolutely everything necessary to avoid a repeat of Professor Sikora's devastating conclusion from the first lockdown?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I understand the point that Professor Sikora makes, and of course I understand the concerns of everybody who has cancer, who has a family member who suffers from cancer or any other life-threatening disease, Mr. Speaker. And it's precisely to protect those non-COVID patients and to give them access to the NHS that we cannot allow our health service to be overwhelmed as it would be on the current projections. And that's why we have to take the action that we're taking now. And I hope he sees the point and why it's precisely because we want to help cancer patients that we need to take the action now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Elizabeth O'Connor, lay in agony for 6 hours after fracturing her hip and breaking 4 ribs, waiting for an ambulance. Her distressed daughters were unable to comfort her or see her when she was initially admitted to hospital. Elizabeth suffers from dementia and lives in a care home. Throughout this pandemic, his government's treatment of care home residents, staff and families has been negligent and unforgivable. The very least he could do is allow one family member to be treated as a key worker for visits to help ease some of this suffering. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, I'm so sorry about the case that she describes, and I've met, as I'm sure members across the House have, family members, bereaved family members of those who have lost their lives in care homes, who haven't been able to visit them, and it is an absolute tragedy. All I can tell here is that we're doing our absolute best to allow people to visit their relatives in extreme circumstances, making sure that they have the PPE that's necessary. But what we cannot have, Mr. Speaker, is another outbreak of the kind that we saw in care homes. And alas, the virus is transmitted readily in care homes and between care homes. Mr. Speaker, we mustn't see that again.
Now heading down to Basil and Billericay with John Barron. John Barron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his statement and will be supporting the government on Wednesday. We must prioritise saving lives wherever possible. But may I suggest the elderly should be allowed more leeway? Given that Sweden recently removed shielding advice for its over 70s, concluding that the general risks to their health from loneliness and isolation outweighed those from the virus, what cost-benefit analysis has the government undertaken as to the balance of risks to public health and society from lockdown on the one hand and from the coronavirus on the other?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're not actually bringing back shielding, as I mentioned earlier on, that we do think the elderly need to take special steps to protect themselves. I just mentioned in connection with Sweden, Mr. Speaker, that actually the Swedish example is not quite the one, not quite the slam dunk that perhaps some people think. If you look at Sweden, they don't, for instance, allow pupils over 15 to get back into school, whereas we prioritise keeping our schools open, Mr. Speaker. And that's the balance that we strike the whole time. It's a balance between keeping our economy moving as far as we can, keeping our schools open, and defeating the virus. And that's what we're trying to do.
Alex Davies-Jones.
Mr. Speaker, we are now halfway through our firebreak lockdown in Wales, and much of the North West, the North East and the West Midlands have faced significant local restrictions for months now. When devolved administrations and local governments argued that the 67% furlough scheme was insufficient, the UK government said that this was the best they could do. And yet, when similar restrictions were extended to England, including large swathes of the south, they then changed their minds and have gone back to 80%. So why does this government have one rule for the south of England and another one for the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the answer is that we have a different package of support for different measures, and that's entirely what you'd expect. But there is now uniformity, and it is our view that furlough remains available throughout the UK.
Big Becker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know the basis on which the Public Health Act 1984 is subject to judicial review. Would he look at the advice given to MPs by Lord Sumption this morning, that now that Parliament is sitting throughout this lockdown, we could increase parliamentary scrutiny and legitimacy of the lockdown by moving to using the Civil Contingencies Act instead of the Public Health Act 1984?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I can certainly reassure him that this measure is time limited. As for the, and will expire on the 2nd of December, as for the legal basis, the Civil Contingencies Act has strict tests known as the triple lock, which must be met before emergency regulations under the Civil Contingencies Act can be made. And one of these is that there must not be existing powers elsewhere. And the 1984 Public Health Act offers clear powers to impose restrictions on public health grounds, and that's why, despite his very useful suggestion, the Public Health Act is the more appropriate route.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one is more disappointed with this lockdown than my constituents in North Norfolk. It is a bitter pill to swallow. We have consistently been one of the lowest infection areas in the entire country. But the simple fact now is that our hospital admissions in the last 4 weeks have gone up by over tenfold. So can the Prime Minister please tell us and reassure my constituents that we have to now have these measures simply to protect my local health services so that they are not overrun?
Speaker, I thank my honourable friend and I congratulate him on the clarity with which he puts the dilemma. Even in areas where the incidence has been very low, Mr. Speaker, it is now climbing very fast.
Heading up to Scotland with Richard Thompson. Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was reported at the weekend that the chair of the UK government's vaccine task force showed official sensitive government documents to an event for US venture capitalists, a move which a former chairman of the Committee of Standards and Public Life described as seriously ill-advised. With jobs being awarded even in the midst of a pandemic, without recourse to open recruitment processes, and billions of pounds of public procurement being awarded without going through open processes, what steps does the Prime Minister plan to take to restore public confidence in the competence and probity of his government, and to help reassure people that there isn't a coronavirus at the heart of his government, which requires eradication every bit as much as the coronavirus outside of it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank people who are working pro bono on the NHS test and trace who come under repeated attack or on our vaccine task force, and it is thanks to their hard work that the UK is among the front runners in being on the verge of being able to deliver a vaccine. If and when a vaccine is produced next year, and I must tell the House it is by no means certain, but if and when it emerges, it will be at least partly thanks to their hard work.
Greg Williams. Greg Williams. Right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister, please, to ensure that he works with devolved administrations to get a united approach for Christmas? My constituents and businesses can ill afford the hokey-cokey of Wales out, England in, Wales back in and England back out.
I'm grateful to my own friend. We continue to work with the devolved administrations and we'll do so throughout this pandemic.
Let's head up to Lancashire with Rosie Cooper. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Prime Minister indicate what assessment he's made about keeping gyms open during the new lockdown in order to support people's health and mental health in an industry with a low prevalence of transmission attributed to it? I'm having many people almost begging that they be enabled to exercise in this way.
Mr. Speaker, with great regret, I must repeat the answer that I've given to colleagues across the House earlier on this afternoon, and that is that we have to put in a full package of measures to get the virus down, and people wishing to know exactly what they are, I've set them out earlier on, but they should look at our website, Mr. Speaker.
Julian Smith.
Speaker, I support the Prime Minister on the difficult balance and difficult decision he had to make this weekend, but can I urge him before he signs off on the guidance to care homes to do everything possible to help those families visiting loved ones in care homes and look at things like the idea of a designated family member who would be tested regularly and able to visit?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right, and that we want to do everything we can to enable loved ones to be visited in care homes, and it is an exceptionally difficult dilemma, but we do think that repeated testing does offer the way forward.
Chris Elmore.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister possibly, Mr. Speaker, could be a bit confused. In his answer to my honourable friend Member Pontypridd, he said that the furlough is across the UK. On the 16th of October, the Welsh First Minister asked the Chancellor to extend the furlough scheme from the 67% to the 80%. On the 19th of October, the Chancellor told the First Minister it could not be done for technical reasons. What are those technical reasons, or is it more about the fact that when it suits the Prime Minister, furlough applies to the whole of the UK, and when it doesn't, for party political reasons, it doesn't?
So, Mr. Speaker, we're going back into measures across England, which are necessary to drive the R down, and they differ. They differ from measures currently obtaining in Scotland, but insofar as people across this country need furlough, in Wales or elsewhere, then they have access to furlough. It is a UK-wide system.
Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, doctors are between 2 and 5 times more likely to take their lives than the general population. In 2018, my constituent, Dr. Jagdeep Sidhu, was a consultant cardiologist at Darren Valley Hospital. He was at the cutting edge of medical treatment, but alas could not cope with the pressure that he faced, and sadly he took his own life. Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister therefore agree that it is vital that we do as much as possible for the welfare of clinicians during what is going to be a very, very challenging time for this profession?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm deeply sorry to hear about the loss of life, the suicide of his constituent, Dr. Jagdeep Sidhu, and all I can say is that we're doing everything we can to support NHS care for its staff, their well-being and their mental health. And I would urge anybody in the NHS who's aware of a colleague who is struggling with their mental health to come forward and seek help.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister please tell the House how many people he estimates were laid off in anticipation of the furlough scheme ending before its last-minute extension, and whether he will make an apology to them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think most fair-minded people would think that this government has done everything it can to support people throughout this crisis, and we're not only extending the furlough scheme now, but also massively increasing help for the self-employed, and we've already put £200 million into supporting people across this country, and we will continue to do so, Mr. Speaker.
Fletcher.
I agree with my right honourable friend that keeping children in school is the right thing to do. However, across the country, children who have received a positive COVID test are being sent home. Yet there will be circumstances where they return to school only to be sent home again because another pupil will have also contracted the virus within their class. In these instances, will the government consider allowing children who have returned after testing positive to stay in school, since they are most likely to have built up an immunity to the disease?
My honourable friend raises a very important point, and that's why we want to roll out the mass testing in the way that we are, in order to isolate the positive cases, Mr. Speaker, and liberate the negatives and allow children to remain in school as much as possible.
Going over to Stella Creasy. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A local mum, Mel, texted me this morning. She's terrified because she works in a supermarket and has only recently returned to work after having shielded because she has a serious medical condition. As lockdown has now returned, she's worried that if she shields again, she will lose her job, but if she doesn't, she will lose her life. What employment protection is the Prime Minister going to offer those who are clinically vulnerable in jobs that cannot be furloughed, so that people like Mel don't have to choose between their lives or their livelihood?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to study the case that she mentions, because what we're saying to those who are clinically vulnerable is that they should not go to work. They should work from home. And I'd be grateful if she would send me the details of her case so that we can establish exactly what help she is entitled to, because she should be entitled to furlough.
A bit more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Keighley and Ilkley have had local restrictions since July, and we are now in Tier 2. Today, we were due to be going into Tier 3 with announcements on that being made last week, but that has been cancelled because we're now going into national restrictions. I cannot stress enough, on behalf of all of my constituents, my local businesses, particularly the small and medium-sized, who are the backbone of Keighley and Ilkley, just how important clarity and clear and concise messaging is, as well as financial support for all of those who are being impacted. So can my right honourable friend explain why Tier 3 is no longer appropriate to slow the impact on hospitals and shine a light on the exit strategy from these national restrictions?
Mr. Speaker, the answer, and I'm grateful, and I understand that why the people of Keighley feel frustrated after so long. But what we've got to do, and their efforts have not been in vain in Tier 3, Mr. Speaker. They have helped to get the R down. They have helped to depress the incidence of the disease. But we must now make a national effort to get it below 1, because it is taking off again. And the way out, as I've told the House already, is to do that now over November, open up again in December, get going with all the technological improvements that I've described, in particular the mass testing that I've outlined to the House already. That, I believe, is the way forward, but it depends on us getting the R below 1 now.
Heading up to Bradford with Imran Hussain. Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents from all faiths have raised serious concerns about the restrictions that will effectively close religious institutions at a time when people need more than ever the comfort and security that their faith provides, putting a heavy burden on people's mental health. Places of worship have gone to great lengths to put COVID-secure measures in place and have demonstrated that congregational prayers can safely take place, with Bradford Council for Mosques in particular leading on this work. So can I urge the Prime Minister to look again at places of worship and more measured policies? And given they have had no financial support since the beginning of this pandemic, can he ensure that they get the financial support that they need?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate what mosques around the country have done to make themselves COVID secure, and what's been done in Bradford and elsewhere. And I know how frustrating it is now for places of worship that we have to take these steps. All I can say is that we need to do them as a country together to get the R down, to get the virus down, and we will continue to ensure that people get the support that they need in the way that I've outlined earlier today, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for the statement he's given today. 2020 has been desperately difficult for the whole country, and I know the Prime Minister is committed to ending these new measures by December the 2nd. But many of my constituents in Meriden are also worried about what will happen afterwards. So can my right honourable friend commit to doing everything he can to at least making sure that we'll have some sort of normal Christmas, and at least make sure that we have measures in place so households will be able to mix at least by December the 25th?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I'm conscious that we've got Diwali, we've got Hanukkah, we've got many religious celebrations coming up in December, and I do want people to have as normal a Christmas as possible, and that's why I think it's very important that the whole country comes together to follow these measures, and I'm sure that if we do, then we can get the R down in the way that I described, and people will have as normal a Christmas as possible.
Send up to Scotland with Alan Brown. Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has rightly stated this lockdown is to protect the English NHS. But when it comes to support, he also keeps telling Scottish MPs that we've just to be happy the extended furlough scheme is UK-wide. If we really are in a partnership of equals, will he confirm that businesses in Kilmarnock and Loudon will get this same level of support if it is needed in the future to protect our local NHS, or is it only going to be available during this period of protecting South East England?
Mr. Speaker, of course, the whole of the country will get funds to protect the NHS as it has throughout this pandemic. And as I've said already this afternoon, there's been £7.2 billion already in Barnett consequentials just to tackle COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has an unenviable set of decisions that he has to make. But can he recognise the frustration that residents in East Sussex feel? We have one of the lowest COVID rates of any county across England, and the admissions for COVID in East Sussex Healthcare Trust is currently 20, and there isn't one placed in a high dependency unit. So the residents have clearly done the right thing, but they are faced with a national lockdown. Can the Prime Minister demonstrate to me that the damage that will be caused to East Sussex by locking down on our economy, on liberty, on lives, on livelihoods, would be a lot worse were we to do absolutely nothing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is a very difficult balance to strike, as he rightly says. But I think that the medical data is, alas, overwhelming, that the virus is doubling everywhere, including in East Sussex, and that eventually the NHS would be overwhelmed, even in East Sussex, with, I'm afraid, catastrophic consequences. We can prevent that by taking the action that we are, and that's why I hope you will support it.
Let's head up to Manchester with Lucy Powell in Manchester Central. Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but I'm still not clear what has actually changed from 2 or 3 weeks ago when the Prime Minister was ridiculing my honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, apart from him yet again changing his strategy. As he himself has said, infection rate rises have slowed over that period, and hospital admissions reflect the infection rate from 2 or 3 weeks ago. This was entirely predictable, and indeed it was predicted. So given that he can't stick with a plan for more than a week, can he now give some real clarity about the criteria for the exit strategy from this national lockdown?
Mr. Speaker, what has changed in the last couple of weeks is, I'm afraid, the facts have changed. And the number of people admitted to hospital, as I said, is up every day. We now have 2,000 more people this Sunday than there were in hospital last Sunday. We cannot escape these inescapable facts. And she asked again, what is the exit strategy? As I've told the House several times, the way forward is to get the R down below 1 with a package of measures that I believe carries support across these benches, and to exploit the many technical advances that we are making.
Flip Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Prime Minister that as a Conservative, I don't believe that collapsing the economy is ever the right solution to any problem. That's why I thought we'd campaigned so hard to stop the Right Honourable Member for Islington North from becoming Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister therefore tell me how many collapsed businesses and how many job losses he and his government believe are a price worth paying to continue pursuing this failed strategy of lockdowns and arbitrary restrictions?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I share his desire to protect the economy, and I believe fervently that we need to get as big and as fast a bounce back as we possibly can. But I also think, alas, that the data is inescapable, and that if we are to avert the loss of many thousands of lives, this is the only option we face. And I think if he looks at the statistics, he looks at the sheer number of fatalities that we could incur, I believe that he will agree it is the right way forward.
Dr. Rupaha.
Speaker, I've heard what the Prime Minister said about congregational worship for faith groups, and it strikes me sitting here that the measures they've taken at Ealing Abbey, 4 to a pew, every other pew roped off, hand sanitizer, one-way system, are exactly what we have here. So doesn't it seem very contradictory? Does he have any message of hope for the monks there? And also, as someone who might be marching down the aisle himself, for the weddings industry. I had an Asian wedding costumier. She thought she'd be ruined by the restrictions. Now they're completely gone. Does he have any hope for any of these people?
Mr. Speaker, the wedding industry, in common with everything else, will, we hope, very much be able to start again on December the 2nd.
Bombay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, maternity leave doesn't just mean sleep deprivation. I have been in Stroud, on the ground, witnessing the superb local response from our NHS, businesses working to get COVID safe, Slimbridge Swans going up in their league, and shops opening on our high streets. But now the government's telling us to park that and hibernate. Can the Prime Minister speak directly to my Tier 1 Stroud communities and convince them that their efforts have not been wasted, and that all of those COVID-safe businesses and organisations will be out of lockdown in December or sooner if we can provide evidence to show that?
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, because it's thanks to the efforts of her constituents in Stroud that the R is not very far above 1 right now. And it's if we all follow the package of measures that I've outlined today, and we all stay at home in the way that I described, we'll be able to open up again on the 2nd of December.
Really?
Speaker, does the Prime Minister understand that extending the furlough scheme on the very day it was supposed to end and doing so for just a month means that in reality many of my constituents whose jobs were furloughed have already been made redundant by their employers in anticipation of its non-availability after the 31st of October? So can those people be re-employed and furloughed until the scheme's new endpoint? And can he tell me whether people who've changed jobs since the original furlough scheme was closed to new applicants are eligible to be furloughed by their new employers who might not have registered for the scheme by the time it closed to new applicants a few months ago?
Mr. Speaker, I hope very much that people will not have been laid off in anticipation of the end of furlough, because there is the job retention scheme, as there is the bonus as well at the end of the year. But to discover exactly what entitlements people have under the extended furlough scheme, they should of course get onto the website. But I think most people appreciate that this government has done a huge amount to support people throughout the crisis and is continuing to do so in this latest phase, and supporting the self-employed, Mr. Speaker.
Richard Oldham.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents in North West Durham do understand the very, very difficult decisions that the Prime Minister is having to take and the very difficult balances he's having to strike. But could he confirm to them and to the House that these Tier 4 measures will end on the December the 2nd? And also to many of my local parents who've got in touch and are concerned the schools could be closed, that actually they will remain open throughout this period.
I'm grateful. They will indeed remain open, Mr. Speaker. And I thank teachers, I thank parents, and I thank the pupils of this country. And I can confirm to him again that these measures will end on December the 2nd in exactly the way that I've set out.
Heading up to Scotland with Douglas Chapman. Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland taxpayers pool their tax resources to the Treasury. But when it comes to sharing, it seems that only English taxpayers benefit from flexibility. In this crisis, we cannot have the English tail wagging the three nations dog. So I'll ask this question again. Will the Prime Minister give the Scottish Government and the devolved administrations the powers to requisition the cash from the Treasury to support furlough schemes when that cash is required in each nation?
Mr. Speaker, the furlough scheme is a UK-wide scheme. It's of course available to Scotland and to the people of Scotland at the moment. Scotland has slightly different arrangements, but already £7.2 billion has already been given in Barnett consequentials to support the people of Scotland throughout the crisis, and more will be forthcoming, Mr. Speaker.
Let's head to Wellingborough with Peter Bone. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been very supportive of the Prime Minister's policy of having local and regional lockdowns, depending on the severity of the disease in a particular area. And there is some good news today. I understand that COVID cases reported today are 5% less than they were 7 days ago. So could the Prime Minister explain why the new lockdown measures were not regarded as Tier 4 and only applied to the areas where there was significant infection, and keep the other areas in the lower tiers, allowing businesses to continue to trade and families to continue to mix?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his, my honourable friend, for his support. But the reality is that at the moment the virus is doubling across the country. We have to take the measures that we've outlined to get it down, and will then be reopening in the way that he describes and recommends, going back into a tiered system, reflecting what's happening locally and regionally.
McCabe.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid for too many people, leadership has now become a crucial factor. Has the Prime Minister considered making way for someone with a skill set better suited to get us through this crisis?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Anthony Bagnall.
Mr. Speaker, I don't mind saying that the members of my constituents of Totnes believe in the Prime Minister's leadership and have felt reassured over the measures that this government has put in place to protect them. So I would also ask that, given that there is an economic impact by this lockdown, and that will have an impact on livelihoods, what can the Prime Minister do to just reassure my constituents, those who have striven so hard since the relaxation of the lockdown on the 4th of July, that there is a brighter future and that this will not be mission creep in terms of a lockdown on the 2nd of December and beyond?
Mr. Speaker, I can't say it often enough that this is a time-limited lockdown, and it ends on December the 2nd, unless this House decides to extend measures of one kind or another. It will come back. Any further measures will be a matter for this House, and it is fully my intention that it should end on December the 2nd.
Heading down to South Wales to Jessica Morden. Jessica Morden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the frustration expressed by other honourable friends for Welsh constituencies that the Prime Minister only acted on furlough when setting out England-wide actions? So, as the Prime Minister hasn't explicitly said this, will furlough support be backdated in Wales? And what funding will come to Wales as a result of business grant support announced on Saturday?
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to support all parts of the UK as we have throughout this crisis.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I applaud very much the Prime Minister's attempts to avoid a national lockdown, and there are no simple answers, that is very clear, which is why data is so important. Oxford's Carl Hennigan has said sadly that the government's advisers have made predictions and projections and illustrations, and when validated against what happened, he said, quote, they were abysmal. Does the Prime Minister share my concerns that these are not isolated cases when academics are showing concern about the data? So will he please publish in full the 4 studies that have gone into the work this weekend, as well as a fuller analysis of lockdowns versus shielding policies, so that people can start to understand and trust the information which is being put out? Thank you.
Well, my honourable friend is entirely right, and to want to look at all the data and all the projections, and I'm very, very happy that we've shared everything. Everything that I've seen is available to him as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 79 care homes in Enfield looking after sick and vulnerable residents who are at a greatly increased risk of death if they catch coronavirus. So can the Prime Minister give me his assurance that Enfield Council and Enfield's care homes will not be put under pressure to take COVID-positive patients upon discharge from hospital?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and we're making sure that no patients are discharged from the NHS without being properly tested, and insofar as they may go into care homes for reasons that are absolutely unavoidable, they must be CQC approved environments where they can be properly looked after and not at risk of infection.
Helpful question. William Ragg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As models of athleticism, the Prime Minister and I know of the benefits of regular gym going, not only for physical health but also mental well-being. Now, Mr. Speaker, knowing that repetition is not a cardinal sin in this House, will he therefore reconsider the intention to close gyms, particularly given the great endeavours they have gone to in making themselves COVID secure?
Mr. Speaker, I'm really grateful to my honourable friend. He's really echoing a point that has been made by many friends and members around the House. I would love to be able to exempt all sorts of activities, sporting or otherwise, Mr. Speaker, but we must get the R down. This is the package that does it.
Let's head up to Greater Manchester with Barbara Keeley. Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, this pandemic has made the problems with our social care system clear. High staff vacancy rates and a reliance on agency staff contributed to the spread of the virus. Lack of funding meant a struggle to afford inflated prices for PPE. The weakness of our social care system ended up costing lives. Now, during the first wave, social care was an afterthought for the government. To ensure it's better supported in the second wave, can the Prime Minister confirm that the government will consider investing the £3.9 billion in social care recommended by the Health and Social Care Select Committee as a starting point for reform?
Prime Minister.
She makes an excellent point, Mrs. Speaker. I'm glad she's citing the amount that we've already invested into social care, and we do indeed intend to use this moment to deliver long-lasting reform of social care in this country.
Douglas Ross.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right. The furlough scheme is UK-wide for the next month. But the crucial answer we need is, will it be available to other nations of the United Kingdom if, in the future, the science demands that further lockdowns are required anywhere in the country? And if he can't give that commitment, will he explain why it seems an English job is more important than a Welsh, Northern Irish or Scottish one?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, but I must repeat what I've said several times already this afternoon. The furlough scheme is a UK-wide scheme. If other parts of the UK decide to go into measures which require the furlough scheme, then of course it's available to them. That has to be right, and that applies not just now, but of course in the future as well, Mr. Speaker.
Now, arts organisations have responded with flair to this existential crisis, the loss of their audience. But just as they're about to recover by going for live streaming from closed venues, and I'm thinking of organisations like the Cambridge Jazz Festival and the London Jazz Festival, they face a new threat. So could the Prime Minister confirm that those closed venues will be treated as a workplace and allow them to continue?
Prime Minister. I will study the matter that the honourable gentleman refers to. I can't see any reason why that should not be the case, but I will get back to him.
Let's head up to Perth in Scotland with Pete Wishart. Pete Wishart.
And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think I heard the Prime Minister just confirm to the Honourable Member for Murray that if the Scottish Government required furlough funds beyond December the 2nd, that will be available to Scotland. Can he now get to his feet and confirm that is what he said and that is what he meant?
Mr. Speaker, the furlough scheme is a UK-wide scheme and will continue to be available wherever it is needed.
Ben Bradley.
Speaker, sport and exercise is hugely important for the health and well-being of the nation. Youth and children's outdoor sports are low risk, both in terms of the age groups and the activities, whilst other sports, like golf, for example, you can take part in without ever coming into contact with another soul. It could help to mitigate some of the more negative impacts in both physical and mental of lockdown, and in my view, the benefits outweigh the risks. So could you consider very carefully allowing some of these outdoor low-risk activities to continue?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I must repeat what I've said earlier on, that there's a wide range of activities that many people would like to pursue. The risk is that you have chains of human contact, whether you like it or not, and that you increase the risk of transmission, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we've set out the measures that we have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Did the Chancellor veto an earlier, shorter circuit breaker lockdown, or can the 40 days of dither and delay, which is likely to cost thousands of extra lives lost and billions of damage to our economy, all be laid at the door of the Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I've already explained that any government, and by the way, the answer to her first question is absolutely not, but any government will hesitate for an age before imposing lockdown measures that take such a toll on people's mental health, on their jobs and on their livelihoods. If you look at what we're doing it in fact earlier in the curve than some other European countries. I think it's the right thing at the right time, and I hope very much that she'll support this package of measures.
Let's head to Gillingham with Raymond Chiste. Raymond Chiste.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement. My specific question is with regards to support for the independent small business sector. My constituent, Rodney Chambers, operates a small card and gift shop in Gillingham. Cards and gifts are considered non-essential, so he will now have to close his shop just before the Christmas period, in the most busiest period of the year for him. At the same time, he will see another shop down the road in Gillingham selling cards and gifts, but selling cleaning products, but they will be able to stay open. That, to me, Mr. Speaker, seems unfair. With the government's excellent support for businesses in the previous lockdown, can the Prime Minister please ensure that those small businesses which now have to close will be given the extra support they need in these difficult, challenging times?
Prime Minister.
I appreciate, Mr. Speaker, that there are many apparent inconsistencies in what is a package of measures that no one wants to impose on this country, and he's right to draw the distinction between the two shops that he describes. What I can tell him is that, in common with all businesses throughout the country, they will continue to receive the support that they need.
Matheson.
Whether it's the self-employed, small business owners who pay themselves via dividends, people who were timed out last time, there are still 3 million excluded in the UK. Will the Prime Minister resist the temptation simply to roll over the current arrangements, but address those 3 million excluded? Because I have to say to the Prime Minister, these measures are unpopular, they are necessary, but people will buy into them if they feel supported, and they will not buy into them, and nor will their friends or family, if they feel that they are continuing to be excluded by this government.
He's entirely right, and that's why we want to put our arms around the people of this country. That's why we're not only putting a huge amount of investment into jobs and into livelihoods, but also supporting the universal credit system, another 9 billion into welfare, plus big investments into councils to help people who are falling on hard times. And he's right to draw attention to those tough cases. We will do everything we can to help them through this. But it's very, very important that everybody who has the disease, who is contacted, does the right thing and self-isolates.
Mr. Speaker, as number 88 on this list, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for remaining on his feet and answering so many questions. But what I'd like to point out are two things. One is golf is a really popular sport. If people are not allowed to go into the golf club, except for using the facilities, the toilets, rather than the bar, would it not be possible for people to be able to exercise doing their golf with maybe a maximum of 2 people, if not 4? Because that would give them the exercise and help their mental health. There's also another point. Supermarkets can sell alcohol, but pubs cannot sell it at all if they're doing a takeaway service. And small breweries are really going to suffer from this because they've got beer in their tanks ready to go, and they will have to pour it down the drain again. Could we not look at it being a level playing field for selling alcohol on a takeaway-only basis?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the ingenious suggestions that she makes. We will take them away. We will study them both carefully, particularly the point of, well, both points are valid. But I must repeat to her, regretfully, the point I've made many times this afternoon about the overall budget of risk that we carry, the need to get the R down, the need to stop the spread of the disease, which is now paramount. And golf and everything else will be able to resume, I devoutly hope, on December the 2nd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, beyond this belated national lockdown, let's say December the 2nd, will northern workers in Tier 3 areas be worth 80% of furlough or 67% of furlough? Which will it be?
It's an important point, but if I may, we will be deciding which tier regions need to go back into, if any, Mr. Speaker, as we come towards the 2nd of December, the week before the 2nd of December. And we'll be announcing that then, and we will also be announcing the financial package at that time.
Jeffrey Clifton-Brown. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend be very kind and explain to my constituents who've contacted me in their hundreds over the weekend, worried about their mental health, about their jobs and businesses, why in Gloucestershire, which only had 1 hospitalised death last week, it makes any sense to lock down all those people?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly why we wanted to pursue the local approach for so long, and that's why I think it was always right to try to avoid a national lockdown for as long as we could. The difficulty is that the overall rate across the whole country is now speeding up, and the virus is doubling. The virus is doubling across the entire country, and I'd be happy to publish all the data as he knows.
Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Sir Jeremy Farrar made it quite clear that the scientific evidence and advice given to government have been absolutely crystal clear, that they must go earlier and harder, impacting now, of course, on businesses, on education, and on health across the country. According to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, the cost of the 2 weeks delay is £20 billion. My question is very simple. It's an expensive mistake. Who's going to pick up the tab?
Mr. Speaker, there's a wealth of scientific advice, and you'll have heard from other parts of the House this afternoon that there are scientists who don't believe that these measures are necessary. We have to look at the balance of the advice. We'd have to take a very, very difficult decision based on the welfare of the country, the health of the country, saving lives, but also protecting the economy. And that's why we came to the judgment that we did.
Going down to Newton Abbot with Anne-Marie Morris. Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you. Prime Minister, I have a particular concern with regard to those individuals with a health problem which is not COVID related. The Right Honourable Member for Altrincham and Sale West did ask you whether or not you'd made an impact assessment. You responded with regard to the economy, but you didn't confirm whether or not there had been an impact assessment on the non-COVID health impact across primary, secondary and tertiary care, not just hospital beds, and indeed whether or not you would publish it. I should be grateful for your confirmation that there is one and you will publish it.
Well, yes, indeed. And I apologise to my right honourable friend, the member for Altrincham and Sale, if I didn't understand his question. But we certainly can publish all the evidence that we have about the consequences for non-COVID patients of failing to keep the autumn surge of COVID under control. And there's abundant evidence that overwhelming the NHS in the course of the next few weeks and months would do huge damage to people's ability to access the services they need for cancer, for heart disease, for many, many other types of interventions that people need in addition to COVID. But I'd be very happy to share that both with her and with my right honourable friend for Altrincham and Sale.
Let's head to South Wales with Kevin Brennan. Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When SAGE advised a national firebreak lockdown, the Welsh First Minister introduced one, which my constituents are now undertaking here in Cardiff West. Given the Prime Minister's statements today, does he agree that Mark Drakeford was right to act?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said throughout this afternoon, I make no apology for doing my utmost to keep this economy going, to keep our kids in school, as indeed we are, and for avoiding the consequences of a national lockdown. And he will have heard the voices that have been raised across this House throughout this afternoon, both in favour of a lockdown and many passionately against it. We have a very difficult balancing job to do, balancing lives, balancing livelihoods, and that's what we're doing.
Let's head to South Leicestershire with Alberto Costa. Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are challenging times, but some warm words to the Prime Minister for the work that he is doing. Oakbury Christmas Tree Farm, run by Richard and Gail in my South Leicestershire constituency, is one of Britain's premier growers and sellers of festive trees. And thankfully, Oakbury Christmas Trees comes under the category of garden centres and is therefore able to remain open over the next few weeks. Can my right honourable friend give some words of encouragement, of cheer, to those businesses that are able to remain open in providing essential goods and services to our constituents, as long as they remain COVID compliant in their working practices?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm thank my honourable friend, and I'm very glad that Oakbury Christmas Trees is able to remain open, and I'm told that they provided number 10 with a free Christmas tree 5 years ago. That's not meant to be any kind of hint, by the way, Mr. Speaker. And I know that they're one of the UK's premier Christmas tree farms, and I thank them for what they're doing.
Let's head to Glasgow with Stephen Bonner. Coatbridge with Stephen Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish Government have repeatedly called for an extension to the furlough scheme for months. However, such calls were completely ignored, with that uncertainty resulting in the loss of many jobs here in Coatbridge, Christine and Bellshill. He may not wish to think it, but that's the reality of this Prime Minister's governance. Mr Speaker, it is lost on absolutely nobody that the Prime Minister refused to extend furlough until the 11th hour, and only when the situation in the south of England ran out of control. At the risk of seeming disbelieving, I must ask him to confirm his U-turn. Does the Prime Minister now fully commit to an extension of the furlough scheme available across all nations of the UK on a when required basis to further protect against otherwise preventable job losses in Scotland and elsewhere?
Listening to the Scottish nationalists, you would have thought that furlough didn't apply in Scotland in the last few months. It's been available throughout the UK throughout this period, and will continue to be a UK-wide solution.
Steve Bryan.
The Prime Minister is doing his best, and I, for one, have great grace for him and the impossible decisions that he has to take. I have to say to him that the weariness, and it must be said anger, of my constituents in Winchester that we're here again is palpable. There's also widespread scepticism that a second national lockdown is right or fair on Hampshire, but we've covered that issue many times, I know. So to help us all, can the Prime Minister tell me what we did not do in June and July, when rates were right down after lockdown number 1, that we should have done, and what therefore are the lessons for after December the 2nd as we try to make the most of lockdown 2.0?
Grateful, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the people of Winchester for what they're doing. I know how frustrating it is, and believe me, I mean, I hope it's obvious from everything I've said this afternoon that I entirely share people's frustrations about this. But NHS tests and trace, if I think that perhaps it's achieved many things, and as I said, 500,000 capacity now per day, where I think we should have pushed harder was on actually insisting that when people were contacted, they isolated. And it doesn't look to me as though the numbers, the proportions have been good enough. We need to get those up in the next phase. But we can, and we will, and we'll get it done.
Toby Perkins.
Mr. Speaker, we all recognise the Prime Minister has got a difficult job, but by God, he's doing it badly. Doesn't he realise, he said a few moments ago, that he's having to balance lives and livelihoods, but his delay is costing lives and livelihoods. Businesses will fold. People will lose their jobs. The strain on our NHS will be greater because he failed to take the advice of Sage and my honourable friend. Will he at least now acknowledge the failure of his policy and start getting in front of this business rather than always playing catch-up and costing lives and livelihoods?
Mr. Speaker, I make no apology for continuing to resist, as I did, for going back into a national lockdown with all the consequences for mental health, for people's lives and livelihoods in the way that I did. And if you look at what has happened, alas, in this country, as across much of Europe, and I pay tribute to people in areas where the incidence is low, who have kept it low. But alas, throughout this country, we have seen an upsurge of the virus overall. And there were plenty of scientists and plenty of medical advisors who were absolutely categorical that a local and regional approach was commonsensical and rational and right. And indeed, the Labour Party supported it, if I remember correctly. Perhaps he even supported it. The Labour Party supported it. What they then decided to do is, of course, a matter for them. But what I think the people of this country want to see at this very, very difficult moment is politicians coming together to take the country forward, to agree on the measures, the Labour Party supported what we were doing, to agree on the measures and to get the country through this latest measures to tackle the autumn surge out the other side on December the 2nd, because that is the best way forward, Mr. Speaker, for our country.
Sir Edmund Lee.
Well, we're almost at the end now, and the Prime Minister's answered the questions with his characteristic charm and skill. But however strong, I'm sure that he won't resist the offer of more help and hope. So would he join me at daily Mass in Westminster Cathedral tomorrow? Would he like to witness the extreme social distancing, the constant cleansing after services, the mask wearing, all factors which are taken far more seriously than virtually anywhere else? And would he like to respond to Cardinal Vincent Nichols and give him the evidence why there is any possibility, with after all these measures, of religious services spreading COVID? Could he offer some hope to the faith communities? Could he perhaps reply to the letter that I've sent to him where we suggest further compromises? For instance, we would have to apply by email before we attend services. Can he offer us any hope at all?
Of course I can, Mr. Speaker. And I thank him for what he has just said. And I'm so sorry that the faith communities temporarily must go through this difficult period of not being able to observe services in the way that they want to. And I would like them to. It is only 28 days, Mr. Speaker, and the hope I can offer, the candle in the darkness, is that we will, if we get this right, be able to go back to something much more like normal life before Christmas, and people will be able to celebrate Christmas in churches and elsewhere across this country.
Lara Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, experts are clear that lockdowns merely defer rather than solve the problem, and they buy us time. They're united that until we have a vaccine, a robust system to test, trace and isolate every case is the best way to both keep people safe and protect our economy. Yet we've heard nothing today that will address the woeful rates of contact tracing or how we improve support and incentives for self-isolation, which he himself has admitted is not working. So what is the Prime Minister going to do to ensure that we avoid a boom and bust cycle of lockdowns, and that he will not squander this lockdown like he did the last one, only for us to be back here in January or February discussing the same issue again?
If I may say so, I think that she raises the most important point, and the one that I think we've been circling around all afternoon. In common with much of the rest of Europe, we're seeing an autumn surge now. I believe we've got the right package of measures to address it. How do we avoid endlessly going in and out of these types of measures in the way that she describes? I think the answer is not just getting people to self-isolate, but also in the mass testing, the lateral flow test, the LAMP tests of the kind that I've described, that will not only help to drive down the R by isolating the positive cases, but will also liberate the negative cases to go about their lives much more normally. That's the game changer that we can all look forward to.
Final question, Jason McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister firstly for answering all 99 questions before mine. My Colne Valley constituents have been pretty much in local restrictions since the start of August, with its impact on local businesses, well-being and mental health. Can I ask the Prime Minister to continue to ask the Chancellor to support businesses in supply chains to the hospitality industry, like food and drink and also microbreweries? And will he also finally look again at whether we can have some COVID-safe outdoor exercise, like golf, like tennis, like exercise classes to support well-being and mental health?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful. I'll look very carefully at his point about microbreweries, which I think he's raised with me before. But I can tell him we can have COVID-secure golf, COVID-secure tennis, COVID-secure whatever he likes in 28 days' time. We've just got to get through this difficult period. I apologise for it. I'm sorry that the nation has to do it, but it is by far the best way forward for the country, Mr. Speaker.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order!